Flatland, A Romance of Many Dimensions by Edwin Abbott, edited and narrated by Toby. Preface. Hello and welcome to this audiobook version of Flatland. First, a little introduction from me, Toby. Flatland is a classic book written by English schoolteacher Edwin Abbott, originally published in 1884. For this audio version, I have edited the text and modernized some of the language to make it easier to understand and more accessible. I've listened to other audio versions of this book that stuck to the original wording, and I found them difficult to follow, especially once it gets to the interesting and complex mathematical ideas. Removing the need to also decipher Victorian prose gives these ideas the brain space they deserve. Another change I've made is to make the book gender neutral. Our characters are shapes, squares, triangles, circles, and lines, living on an imaginary infinite plane. Readers familiar with the original text will know that it contained strong commentary on women's treatment in Victorian society. Abbott later clarified that these were meant as satire, but the nuance has become less apparent over time. You will still encounter these themes in this audio version, but what were originally called women are now referred to simply as straight lines. Flatland includes some of the earliest discussions of dimensionality and the concept of the fourth dimension in popular literature. Over the years, I've often wanted to recommend it to others, but hesitated because the language and certain themes could be off-putting. In editing this version, I've created a Flatland that I'm happy to share with everyone, preserving the key ideas while making them more approachable. If you're curious, you can find many public domain copies of the original text online. There are two parts to this book. The first describes the world of Flatland, the shapes and their social structures, the ways they identify one another by sight or touch, and various historical upheavals. You may notice themes from our own world, such as discrimination based on class, gender, and disability. Part 2 is where the exciting narrative begins, exploring higher dimensions and providing analogies that help us imagine the fourth dimension. If you aren't too interested in the description of Flatland itself, feel free to jump straight to Part 2. I've written my own book called A Guide to Making Friends in the Fourth Dimension, which will be published by mid-2025. Flatland originally inspired my interest in dimensions. It's truly a foundational text, and I wanted to share it with you in this updated form before my own work comes out. With these changes, I believe you'll find Flatland enjoyable and inspiring, just as it inspired me. So let's get started. Dedication. This work is dedicated to the inhabitants of space in general by a humble native of Flatland, in the hope that, just as I was introduced to the mysteries of 3 dimensions, having previously known only 2, so too the citizens of that celestial realm may aspire yet higher and higher to the secrets of 4, 5, or even 6 dimensions, thereby contributing to the enlargement of the imagination and the possible development of that most rare and excellent gift of modesty among the beings of solid humanity. Part 1. This World. Be patient, for the world is broad and wide. Chapter 1. Of the Nature of Flatland. I call our world Flatland, not because we call it that ourselves, but to help you, my fortunate readers who live in 3-dimensional spaceland, better understand its nature. Imagine a vast sheet of paper where straight lines, triangles, squares, pentagons, hexagons, and other shapes move freely on its surface, but without the power to rise above or sink below it. These shapes are very much like shadows, only hard and with luminous edges. This will give you a good idea of my world and its inhabitants. Only a few years ago I would have called it my universe, but my mind has since been opened to a higher view of things. In such a place, you'll quickly realize that it's impossible for anything solid, as you know it, to exist. You might assume that we could at least visually distinguish triangles, squares, and other shapes moving around as I've described. However, we can't see them in that way. In fact, we can't distinguish one shape from another by sight alone. All that is visible to us are straight lines, and I'll soon explain why this is the case. Place a coin on the middle of a table in your three-dimensional space. Lean over it and look straight down. It appears as a circle. But now step back to the edge of the table and slowly lower your eye level, thus bringing yourself closer to the perspective of a flatlander. You'll notice the coin appears more and more oval, and finally, when your eye is exactly level with the tabletop, as if you were a flatlander, the coin no longer appears oval at all, but becomes, as far as you can see, a straight line. The same thing would happen if you were to repeat this exercise with a triangle, a square, or any other figure cut out of cardboard. As soon as you look at it with your eye level with the table's edge, it stops appearing as a shape and looks like a straight line. For example, take an equilateral triangle, a respectable member of our society. When viewed from directly above, you can clearly see the triangle's three equal sides and angles. As you begin to lower your eye level, the triangle starts to appear differently. The height of the shape seems to compress, and the angles appear less pronounced. The triangle appears more like a distorted, flattened figure. Finally, when your eye is exactly level with the surface of the table, which is how we perceive things in Flatland, the triangle no longer appears as a triangle at all. Instead, it presents itself solely as a straight line. When I was in Spaceland, I heard that your sailors have similar experiences when navigating the seas and spotting distant islands or coastlines on the horizon. The far-off land may have bays, cliffs, and any number of angles in and out, but from a distance you see none of these. This is unless the sun shines directly upon them, revealing their features through light and shadow. Otherwise, you see nothing but an unbroken grey line on the water. Well, that's exactly what we see when one of our triangular or other shaped acquaintances comes toward us in Flatland. Since we have no sun or light sources that create shadows, we lack the visual aids you have in Spaceland. If our friend comes closer, their line appears longer. If they move away, it becomes shorter, but they always appear as straight lines, whether they're a triangle, square, pentagon, hexagon, circle, or any other shape. They always look like straight lines and nothing more. You may perhaps ask how, under these disadvantageous circumstances, we are able to distinguish our friends from one another. But the answer to this very natural question will be more easily given when I come to describe the inhabitants of Flatland. For now, let me defer this subject and say a word or two about the climate and houses in our world. Chapter 2 of the Climate and Houses in Flatland. Just as in your world, we have 4 points of the compass: north, south, east, and west. Since we have no sun or other heavenly bodies, it's impossible for us to determine north in the usual way. However, we have our own method. According to the law of nature in our world, there is a constant attraction toward the south. The pull to the south is sufficient to serve as a compass in most parts of our land. The strength of this southward attraction varies across Flatland. In some regions it's strong, in others it's weak. In your world, temperate zones are those with moderate climates, not too hot and not too cold. With no sun, Flatland lacks weather in the traditional sense, but our temperate zones refer to regions where this southward attraction is very slight. The attraction is so slight in our temperate zones that inhabitants can move northward with relative ease. Here, even a shape in feeble health can journey a mile northward without much difficulty. Additionally, rain, which falls at regular intervals, always comes from the north, providing further assistance in determining direction. In urban areas, we have the guidance of the houses, which, of course, have their side walls running for the most part north and south, so that the roofs may keep off the rain from the north. In the countryside, where there are no houses, the trunks of trees serve as some sort of guide. Altogether, we do not have as much difficulty as one might expect in determining our bearings. Despite this, I have sometimes found myself in trouble while journeying through our most temperate regions, where the southward attraction is hardly felt at all. I recall times when I was walking across a perfectly desolate plain without houses or trees to guide me, and I was compelled to stop for hours, remaining stationary and waiting for the rain to come and orient me before continuing my journey. For the weak and elderly, the force of attraction affects them much more than those who are strong and healthy. Therefore, it is considered polite, if you meet someone on the street who may be struggling, to always give them the north side of the way. No easy task in a climate where it's difficult to distinguish north and south. Our houses have no windows, for light comes to us both in our homes and outside, by day and by night, at all times and in all places, though we don't know where it comes from. In the past, it was an interesting and often studied question among our learned individuals. What is the origin of light? Many attempted to solve it, but their efforts led only to frustration and despair. The pursuit of answers to this question served no other result than to crowd our asylums with the would-be solvers. Hence, after fruitless attempts to suppress such investigations indirectly by making them liable to a heavy tax, the law, in comparatively recent times, absolutely prohibited them. Alas, I, alone in Flatland, now know all too well the true solution to this mysterious problem, but my knowledge cannot be made intelligible to a single one of my fellow Flatlanders, and I am mocked. I, the sole possessor of the truths of space, and of the theory of how light enters our land from the world of 3 dimensions, am mocked as if I were speaking utter nonsense. But enough of these painful digressions. Let me return to explaining our houses. The most common house construction is a 5-sided pentagon. The 2 northern sides form the roof and typically have no doors. On the east side is a small door for the lines, and on the west a much wider one. The southern side, or floor, usually has no door. Square and triangular houses are not permitted, and for good reason. The angles of a square, and even more so those of an equilateral triangle, are much sharper than those of a pentagon. Given that the lines of inanimate objects, such as houses, are dimmer than the lines of living beings, there's considerable danger that the points of a square or triangular house might cause serious injury to an inattentive traveller who might suddenly run into them. Triangular houses were the first to be universally banned by law. This has been in effect for hundreds of years, with exceptions only for military sites, fortifications, and other government buildings which the general public should not be approaching without caution. Until recently, square houses were still permitted everywhere, though they were discouraged by a special tax. However, 3 centuries after triangular houses were banned, the law decreed that in all towns with a population above 10,000, the angle of a pentagon was the smallest house angle allowed for public safety. The community's good sense supported the legislators' efforts, and now, even in rural areas, pentagonal construction has replaced all others. Only occasionally, in some very remote and backward agricultural district, might an antiquarian still discover a square house. Chapter 3. Concerning the inhabitants of Flatland. The greatest length or breadth of a fully grown inhabitant of Flatland may be estimated at about 11 of your inches. 12 inches may be regarded as the maximum. The least valued members of our society are straight lines. Our soldiers and lowest class of workers are triangles with 2 equal sides, each about 11 inches long, and a base or a third side so short, often not exceeding half an inch, that they form very sharp and formidable angles at their vertices. Indeed, when their bases are very small, no more than 1/8 of an inch in size, they can hardly be distinguished from straight lines. Their vertices are extremely pointed. Like in your world, these triangles are distinguished from others by being called isosceles, and by this name I shall refer to them in the following pages. Our middle class consists of equilateral or equal-sided triangles. Our professionals and scholars are squares, to which class I myself belong, and 5-sided figures or pentagons. Next above these come the nobility, of whom there are several degrees, beginning with 6-sided figures or hexagons. The prestige of these shapes increases with increasing side number, until one is given the honorable title of polygonal or many-sided. Beyond this, there are a few esteemed individuals for whom the number of their sides is so numerous and the sides themselves so small that the shape cannot be distinguished from a circle. These revered shapes are included in the circular or priestly order, and this is the highest class of all. In terms of reproduction, a shape must be partnered with a line. Their offspring can take one of 2 forms: a short young line offspring, or, much to the delight of the parents, a multi-sided child. It is a law of our nature that this multi-sided child possesses a number of sides, one more than their multi-sided parent. The child of a square and a line is a pentagon. The child of a pentagon and a line is a hexagon, and so on. This way, each generation shall rise one step in the scale of development and nobility. However, this rule does not always apply to the equilateral triangles, and still less often to the isosceles, who indeed can hardly be said to deserve the name of shape, since they have not all their sides equal. With them, therefore, the law of nature does not hold, and the child of an isosceles, i.e. a triangle with 2 sides equal, remains isosceles still. Nevertheless, there is still hope for the isosceles to eventually improve their standing. It is found that the more intelligent among the isosceles manifest a slight increase of their third side or base and a shrinkage of the other 2 sides. Intermarriages arranged by the priests between the children of the more even isosceles generally result in an offspring approximating still more to the type of the equal-sided triangle. The rare birth of a true equilateral triangle from an isosceles parent is celebrated throughout our land for many miles around. After a strict examination conducted by the Sanitary and Social Board, the infant, if certified as regular, is ceremonially admitted into the class of equilaterals. The child is then immediately taken from their proud yet sorrowing parents and adopted by some childless equilateral who is bound by oath never to allow the child to return to their former home or even to acknowledge their relatives again, for fear that the newly developed individual might, through unconscious imitation, fall back into their hereditary level. The occasional emergence of an equilateral from the ranks of their isosceles ancestors is welcomed, not only by the poor isosceles themselves, as a gleam of light and hope amid the monotonous hardships of their existence, but also by the aristocracy at large. All the higher classes are well aware that these rare phenomena, while doing little to dilute their own privileges, serve as a most useful barrier against revolution from below. Had the acute-angled rabble been all, without exception, absolutely destitute of hope and of ambition, they might have found leaders in some of their many rebellious outbreaks, so able as to render their superior numbers and strength too much for even the wisdom of the circles. However, as it is, the polygons and circles are almost always able to stifle rebellion in its very cradle, taking advantage of the boundless hopefulness of the mind. Art also aids law and order. It is generally found possible, by a little artificial compression or expansion on the part of the state's physicians, to make some of the more capable leaders of a rebellion perfectly regular, and to admit them at once into the privileged classes. A much larger number, who are still below the standard, allured by the prospect of being ultimately ennobled, are induced to enter the state hospitals, where they are kept in honourable confinement for life. One or two alone of the more headstrong, foolish, and hopelessly irregular are led to execution. Then, in the event of an attempted revolt, the rabble of the isosceles, planless and leaderless, are either transfixed without resistance by the small body of their brethren whom the chief circle keeps on pay for emergencies of this kind, or else, more often, by means of jealousies and suspicions skilfully instigated among them by the circular party, they are stirred to mutual warfare and perish by one another's angles. No less than 120 rebellions exist in our records, in addition to minor outbreaks numbered at 235, and they have all ended in this manner. Chapter 4. Concerning the lines. If our highly pointed triangles of the soldier class are formidable, it may be readily inferred that far more formidable are our lines. For if a soldier is a wedge, a line is a needle, being, so to speak, all point, at least at the two extremities. Add to this the power of making themselves practically invisible at will, and you will perceive that a line in Flatland is a creature by no means to be trifled with. But here, perhaps, some of my younger readers may ask how a line in Flatland can make themselves invisible. This ought, I think, to be apparent without any explanation. However, a few words will make it clear to everyone. Place a needle on a table, then with your eye on the level of the table, look at it sideways, and you will see the whole length of it. But look at it endways, and you see nothing but a point. It has become practically invisible. Just so it is with one of our lines. When their side is turned towards us, we see them as a straight line. When the end containing their eye or mouth, for us these two organs are identical, is the part that meets our eye, then we see nothing but a highly lustrous point. But when the back is presented to our view, then, being only sublustrous, and indeed almost as dim as an inanimate object, their hinder extremity serves as a kind of invisible cap. By now, the dangers posed by lines must be clear to everyone in Spaceland. Even the angles of a respectable middle-class triangle carry risks, and running into an isosceles can cause a severe injury. A mere touch from the vertex of a soldier carries the risk of death. So what can running into a line result in, except absolute and immediate destruction? Moreover, when a line is invisible, or only visible as a faint, dim point, how difficult must it be, even for the most cautious, to always avoid a collision? Many enactments have been made at different times in the various states of Flatland to minimize this peril. In the southern and less temperate climates, where the force of gravitation is greater, and inhabitants are more prone to casual and involuntary motions, the laws concerning lines are naturally much more stringent. However, a general overview of the code can be obtained from the following summary. 1. Every house shall have one entrance on the eastern side, exclusively for the use of lines. All lines shall enter in a becoming and respectful manner, and not through the western door. 2. No line shall walk in any public place without continually keeping up their peace cry, under penalty of death. 3. Any line duly certified to be suffering from fits, chronic cold accompanied by violent sneezing, or any disease necessitating involuntary motions shall be instantly destroyed. In some states, there is an additional law forbidding lines, under penalty of death, from walking or standing in any public place without constantly moving their backs from right to left so as to indicate their presence to those behind them. Other laws require a line, when traveling, to be accompanied by another shape, yet others confine lines altogether to their houses except during religious festivals. Obviously, a line should not be provoked as long as it is in a position where it can turn around. When they are confined to their apartments, which are constructed with a view to denying them that power, you can say and do what you like, for they are then entirely incapable of causing trouble. However, the wisest circles have discovered that increasing restrictions on lines tends not only to weaken them, but also leads to a rise in domestic murders. These oppressive conditions foster an environment where a state loses more than it gains. There is an additional risk that by exasperating a line's temper by confinement at home or by restrictive regulations outside, they may direct their anger toward other shapes. In less temperate climates, the whole non-line population of a village is sometimes destroyed in 1 or 2 hours of simultaneous line outbreak. Hence, the 3 laws mentioned earlier suffice for the better regulated states, and may be accepted as a rough exemplification of our line code. Ultimately, our main safeguard is not found in legislation, but in the interests of the lines themselves. While they can inflict instantaneous death with a retrograde movement, unless they can promptly retract their sharp extremities from their victim's struggling body, their own fragile forms are at risk of being shattered. To my readers in Spaceland, the condition of our lines may seem truly deplorable, and indeed it is. Even an isosceles may look forward to some improvement of its angle and the ultimate elevation out of its class, but no line can entertain such hopes for their kind. Once a line, always a line, is a decree of nature, and even the laws of evolution seem suspended in their disfavor. Many members of higher society are able to justify our treatment of lines by insisting that lines, due to their one-dimensional nature, possess no brains or intellect. They assert that lines have no memory to recall and no forethought to anticipate the miseries and humiliations that are both a necessity of their existence and the foundation of Flatland's constitution. Chapter 5 of our methods of recognizing one another. You who are blessed with shade as well as light, you who are gifted with 2 eyes, endowed with a knowledge of perspective, and charmed with the enjoyment of various colors, you who can actually see an angle and contemplate the complete circumference of a circle in the happy region of the 3 dimensions, how shall I make clear to you the extreme difficulty which we in Flatland experience in recognizing one another's configuration? Remember what I mentioned earlier? In Flatland, all beings, whether living or non-living, regardless of their shape, appear the same or nearly identical to our eyes, that of a straight line. So how can one be distinguished from another when all shapes appear the same? The answer is threefold. The first method of recognition is the sense of hearing, which is much more developed in us than in you. This allows us not only to recognize our personal friends by their voices, but also to distinguish between different shapes, at least among the lower orders. However, as we ascend in the social order, it becomes harder to discriminate and be discriminated by hearing alone. This difficulty arises partly because voices become more similar, and partly because the ability to distinguish voices is seen as a plebeian virtue not well developed among the aristocracy. Additionally, whenever there is any danger of impersonation, we cannot rely on this method. Amongst our lowest orders, the vocal organs are more developed relative to our hearing, allowing an isosceles to mimic the voice of a polygon easily, and with some training, that of a circle. Therefore, a second method is more commonly used. Feeling is among our lines and lower classes, I will discuss our upper classes shortly, the primary means of recognition, especially between strangers and when determining not individual identities but social classes. What you in Spaceland refer to as an introduction, we in Flatland call the process feeling. Permit me to ask you to feel and be felt by my friend so-and-so is still among the more old-fashioned shapes in remote districts the customary formula for a Flatland introduction. However, in the towns and among business people, the words be felt by are omitted and the sentence is shortened to, let me ask you to feel so-and-so, although it is assumed, of course, that the feeling is reciprocal. Among our still more modern and stylish young shapes, who are highly averse to superfluous effort and supremely indifferent to the purity of their native language, the formula is further shortened by using to feel in a technical sense, meaning to recommend for the purposes of feeling and being felt. Currently, the slang of polite or fast society in the upper classes accepts such a barbarism as Dr. Smith, permit me to feel Dr. Jones. Let my readers in Spaceland not assume that feeling is the tedious process for us that it would be for you, or that we find it necessary to feel right around all the sides of every individual before determining their shape. Extensive practice and training, starting in schools and continuing through daily life, enable us to immediately distinguish between the angles of an equilateral triangle, square, and pentagon by touch. I need not mention that the vertex of an acute angled isosceles is obvious even to the dullest touch. It is therefore not necessary as a rule to do more than feel a single angle of an individual, and this, once identified, reveals the shape of the individual whom we are addressing, unless indeed they belong to the higher sections of the nobility. In those cases, the difficulty is much greater. Even a Master of Arts from our University of Wentbridge has been known to confuse a 10-sided polygon with a 12-sided one, and there is hardly a Doctor of Science in or out of that renowned university who could pretend to decide promptly and unhesitatingly between a 20-sided and a 24-sided member of the aristocracy. Those of my readers who recall the extracts I gave earlier from the legislative code concerning lines will readily understand that the process of introduction by contact requires some care and discretion. Otherwise, the angles might inflict irreparable injury on the unwary feeler. It is necessary for the safety of the feeler that the felt remains perfectly still. A sudden movement, a fidgety shift in position, or even a violent sneeze has been known to prove fatal to the incautious and to nip in the bud many promising friendships. This is especially true among the lower classes of triangles. With them, the eye is situated so far from their vertex that they can scarcely perceive what occurs at that extremity of their frame. It is no wonder, then, that a sudden head movement has caused the state to lose many valuable lives. I have heard that an esteemed ancestor of mine, one of the least irregular of their unhappy isosceles class, who shortly before passing received 4 out of 7 votes from the Sanitary and Social Board to elevate to the class of equal-sided, often sadly recalled with tears in their eye a tragedy that befell a great 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 ancestor, a respectable triangle with an angle of 59 degrees and 30 minutes. According to this account, my unfortunate ancestor, suffering from rheumatism and in the act of being felt by a polygon, accidentally struck the great shape through the diagonal with a sudden movement. As a result, partly due to prolonged imprisonment and degradation, and partly because of the moral shock that affected the entire family, the family lost a degree and a half in their progression towards better things. The consequence was that in the next generation, each child's angle was registered at only 58 degrees, and it wasn't until 5 generations later that the lost ground was regained, the full 60 degrees attained, and the ascent from the isosceles finally accomplished. This whole series of calamities was caused by one little accident in the process of feeling. At this point, I think I hear some of my better educated readers exclaim, "How could you in Flatland know anything about angles and degrees or minutes? We can see an angle because we in the region of Spaceland can see two straight lines meeting at an incline, but you, who can only ever see a single straight line, or at best a series of straight lines that appear as one, how could you possibly discern an angle, let alone measure angles of different sizes?" My response is that while we cannot see angles, we infer them with great precision. Our sense of touch, sharpened by necessity and honed through long training, allows us to distinguish angles far more accurately than your sense of sight when unaided by tools like rulers or protractors. I believe I've provided enough information to show that recognition by touch is neither as tedious nor as uncertain as one might think, and it is clearly more trustworthy than recognition by hearing. Still, as mentioned earlier, the objection remains that this method is not without danger. For this reason, many in the middle and lower classes, and all without exception in the polygonal and circular orders, prefer a third method, which I will describe in the next chapter. Chapter 6 of Recognition by Sight. I am about to appear very inconsistent. In previous sections, I have said that all shapes in Flatland present the appearance of a straight line, and it was added or implied that it is consequently impossible to distinguish between individuals of different classes. Yet now I am about to explain to my Spaceland critics how we are able to recognize one another by the sense of sight. If, however, the listener will take the trouble to refer back to the passage in which recognition by feeling is stated to be universal, they will notice the stipulation, among the lower classes. It is only among the higher classes and in our temperate climates that sight recognition is practiced. The fact that this ability exists in any regions and for any classes is due to the presence of fog, which dominates most of the year except in the torrid zones. What you in Spaceland consider a pure nuisance, obscuring landscapes, dampening spirits, and enfeebling health, is seen by us as a blessing, almost as vital as air itself, nurturing our arts and fostering our sciences. But let me explain my point without further praise for this beneficial element. If fog didn't exist, all lines would appear equally clear and indistinguishable from one another. This is actually the situation in those unfortunate regions where the atmosphere is completely dry and transparent. However, in areas with a generous amount of fog, objects just 3 feet away appear noticeably dimmer than those only 2 feet 11 inches away. As a result, through careful and continuous observation of these differences in brightness, we can accurately infer the shape of an object we're looking at. One example will explain my point better than any amount of generalizations. Suppose I see two individuals approaching whose shape I wish to ascertain. They are, we will suppose, a merchant and a physician, or in other words, an equilateral triangle and a pentagon. How am I to distinguish them? It will be clear to anyone with basic knowledge of geometry that if I position my eye to look straight on at the angle of the approaching individual, I'll be able to see both sides evenly, as my view will lie equally between them. This allows me to observe both sides as if they are of the same length. Now, if the individual is an equilateral triangle, what will I see? I'll see a straight line, with the center point closest to me appearing very bright. But as the sides of the equilateral triangle quickly recede into the fog, the line will fade rapidly into dimness, making the ends of the line appear very faint. On the other hand, if the individual is a pentagon, I will also see a straight line with a bright center. However, in this case, the line will fade less rapidly into dimness because the sides recede more gradually into the fog. As a result, the ends of the line will appear less dim than those of the equilateral triangle. The listener will probably understand from these examples how, after extensive training and constant practice, it becomes possible for the educated classes among us to distinguish with reasonable accuracy between the middle and lower orders by sight. If my Spaceland patrons can grasp this idea and at least entertain the possibility without dismissing my account as entirely unbelievable, then I will have achieved what I reasonably hope for. Attempting further details would only lead to confusion. Yet for the sake of the young and inexperienced, who might mistakenly assume from the simple examples I've provided that recognizing others by sight is easy, it's important to note that, in reality, most situations involving sight recognition are far more subtle and complex. For instance, if my triangular parent approaches me and happens to present their side instead of their angle, I might initially be uncertain whether they are a triangle or a straight line, until I ask them to rotate or adjust my position to view them from a different angle. There is some doubt. When I'm with one of my two hexagonal grandchildren, looking directly at one of their sides, I will see a bright line with little fading at the ends, while the other two sides will appear dimmer and fade even more towards their far ends. But I must resist the temptation to go into too much detail on these topics. Even the meanest mathematician in Spaceland will easily understand that the challenges faced by the educated, especially when they themselves are moving, turning, advancing, or retreating, while also trying to visually distinguish between numerous high-ranking polygons moving in different directions, such as in a ballroom or social gathering, are enough to challenge even the sharpest minds. This complexity more than justifies the rich endowments devoted to the distinguished professors of geometry, both static and kinetic, at the prestigious University of Wentbridge, where the science and art of sight recognition is regularly taught to large classes of Flatland's elite. Only a few descendants from our most noble and wealthy families can afford the time and money required to fully pursue this valuable and prestigious art. Even for me, a mathematician of no mean standing and the grandparent of two promising, perfectly regular hexagons, being surrounded by a crowd of rotating polygons from the higher classes can sometimes be quite confusing. Of course, for a common triangle, such a scene would be nearly as incomprehensible as it would be for you, my listener, if you were suddenly transported to our world. In such a crowd, you would see nothing around you but a single line, seemingly straight, but constantly shifting in brightness and dimness. Even if you had completed your third year in the pentagonal and hexagonal classes at the university and mastered the theory, you'd still need many more years of experience before navigating a fashionable crowd without bumping into those of higher rank, whom it is against etiquette to ask to feel. Their superior education and culture allow them to know all about your movements, while you know little to nothing about theirs. In short, to conduct oneself perfectly in polygonal society, one must be a polygon. That, at least, is the painful lesson from my experience. It is astonishing how much the art, or I may almost call it instinct, of sight recognition improves with regular practice and by avoiding the habit of feeling. Anyone who relies on feeling early in life will never master seeing to its fullest potential. For this reason, among our higher classes, feeling is discouraged or absolutely forbidden. From the cradle, their children, instead of going to the public elementary schools, where the art of feeling is taught, are sent to elite private schools. At our illustrious university, to feel is regarded as a most serious fault, leading to temporary suspension for the first offense and expulsion for the second. Among the lower classes, the art of sight recognition is regarded as an unattainable luxury. A common triangle cannot afford to let their child spend a third of their life in abstract studies. The children of the poor are therefore allowed to feel from their earliest years, and they gain therefore a precocity and an early liveliness which contrast at first most favourably with the sluggish, underdeveloped, and listless behaviour of the youths of the polygonal class. However, once those polygonal students complete their university education and begin applying their knowledge, the change that comes over them is so significant that it could almost be called a rebirth. In every field, whether art, science, or social life, they quickly surpass their triangular peers. Only a few of the polygonal class fail to pass the final test or leaving examination at the university. The situation of this unsuccessful minority is truly pitiable. Rejected from the higher class, they are also despised by the lower. They have neither the matured and systematically trained powers of the polygonal bachelors and masters of arts, nor yet the native precocity and adaptability of the youthful triangles. Careers in professional fields and public service are closed to them, and although most states don't forbid them from marrying, they face great difficulty in finding willing partners. Experience shows that the children of such unfortunate and ill-endowed parents are often just as unfortunate, if not outright irregular. It is from these rejected members of our nobility that the great uprisings and rebellions of the past have often found their leaders. The mischief they have caused has been so great that an increasing number of progressive statespeople believe true mercy would require complete suppression of these failures. They suggest enacting laws that would either imprison for life those who fail to pass the final examination of the university or extinguish them by a painless death. I realize I am starting to digress into the topic of irregulars, an issue so important that it deserves its own chapter. Chapter 7: Concerning Irregular Figures. Throughout the previous pages, I have been assuming, what should perhaps have been made clear from the start, that every individual in Flatland is a regular figure, meaning they are of regular construction. By this I mean that a line must not only be a line, but a straight one. An isosceles must have two equal sides. Equilateral triangles must have three equal sides. Squares, the group to which I humbly belong, must have four equal sides, and in general, all sides of any polygon must be equal. The length of the sides naturally depends on the individual's age. A newborn line might be about an inch long, while a tall adult line could extend to a foot. For individuals of all other classes, the combined length of an adult's sides, when added together, is typically around 2 feet or slightly more. However, the size of our sides isn't the focus here. I'm referring to the equality of sides, and it does not need much reflection to see that the whole of the social life in Flatland rests upon the fundamental fact that nature intends all figures to have their sides equal. If our sides were unequal, our angles might be unequal. Instead of it being sufficient to feel or estimate by sight a single angle in order to determine the form of an individual, it would be necessary to ascertain each angle by the experiment of feeling. But life would be too short for such a tedious grouping. The whole science and art of sight recognition would at once perish. Feeling, so far as it is an art, would not survive long. There would be an end to all confidence, all forethought. No one would be safe in making the most simple social arrangements. In a word, civilization would relapse into barbarism. Am I moving too quickly for my listeners to follow these obvious conclusions? Surely, with just a moment's thought and a simple example from everyday life, anyone can see that our entire social structure relies on regularity or equality of angles. For instance, when you pass 2 or 3 equilateral triangles on the street, you immediately recognize them as tradespeople by the shape of their angles and their quickly dimming sides, and you invite them into your home for lunch without a second thought. This you do at present with perfect confidence, because everyone knows, to an inch or two, the area occupied by an adult triangle. But imagine that the triangle drags behind their regular and respectable vertex a parallelogram of 12 or 13 inches in diagonal. What are you to do with such a monster sticking out of your home's door? But I am insulting the intelligence of my listeners by accumulating details which must be obvious to everyone who enjoys the advantages of a residence in Spaceland. Obviously, the measurements of a single angle would no longer be sufficient in such dire circumstances. One whole life would be taken up by feeling or surveying the perimeter of one's acquaintances. Even now, avoiding collisions in a crowd is challenging enough, even for a well-educated square. If no one could assess the regularity of the shapes in their company, all would be chaos and confusion. In the slightest panic, serious injuries could occur, especially if there were any lines or isosceles present, potentially resulting in considerable loss of life. Practicality, therefore, aligns with nature in endorsing the importance of regularity in shape, and the law has not been backward to reinforce this. Irregularity of figure, for us, carries the same weight, or even more, as a combination of moral corruption and criminality in your world, and is treated accordingly. It's true that some critics argue there's no inherent link between geometrical and moral irregularity. They claim the irregular is, from birth, rejected by their parents, mocked by siblings, ignored by household staff, scorned and distrusted by society, and excluded from any position of responsibility or usefulness. Every move they make is closely monitored by the authorities until they come of age and face inspection. If they exceed the allowable deviation, they are destroyed, or if within the limit, they are confined to a low-level government office as a seventh-class clerk, forbidden from marrying, forced into monotonous work for a miserable wage, living and eating at the office, and even taking vacations under strict surveillance. How could a person's nature, even in the best of us, not become bitter and distorted under such conditions? All of this seemingly logical reasoning doesn't convince me, just as it hasn't convinced the wisest of our leaders, that our ancestors were wrong in declaring it a fundamental policy that tolerating irregularity is incompatible with the safety of the state. Yes, the life of an irregular is undoubtedly difficult, but the well-being of the majority requires it to be so. If someone with a triangular front and a polygonal back were allowed to live and have even more irregular offspring, what would happen to the structure of society? Should we redesign our houses, doors, and public buildings to accommodate such abnormalities? Should ticket collectors have to measure everyone's perimeter before letting them into a theatre or lecture hall? Should an irregular be exempt from military service? And if not, how do we stop them from disrupting their fellow soldiers? Moreover, how tempting would it be for such a person to commit fraud? How easy would it be for them to approach a shop with their polygonal side, deceive a trusting merchant, and order goods to any extent? While advocates of so-called philanthropy may argue for the repeal of the irregular penal laws, I've never encountered an irregular who wasn't exactly what nature intended: deceptive, antisocial, and, up to the limits of their power, a perpetrator of all manner of mischief. I'm not inclined to recommend the extreme measures taken by some states where an infant whose angles deviates by even half a degree from the norm is immediately destroyed at birth. Some of our most brilliant and capable individuals, shapes of real genius, started their lives with deviations as large as or even greater than 45 minutes. Losing them would have been an irreparable blow to the state. The art of healing has also made some of its greatest breakthroughs through procedures like compression, extension, and other surgeries that have partially or fully corrected irregularity. Therefore, I advocate for a middle ground. Instead of a rigid rule, I propose that when a child's form is just beginning to set and the medical board determines recovery is unlikely, the irregular should be painlessly and mercifully put to an end. Chapter 8 of the Ancient Practice of Painting. If my listeners have been paying attention so far, they won't be surprised to learn that life in Flatland can be somewhat dull. I don't mean to say that there aren't battles, conspiracies, tumults, factions, and all the other phenomena that make history interesting, nor would I deny that the strange mixture of the problems of life and the problems of mathematics holds a certain zest to our existence that might be hard for those in Spaceland to comprehend. I speak now from the aesthetic and artistic point of view when I say that life with us is dull, aesthetically and artistically, very dull indeed. How can it be otherwise when all one's prospect, all one's landscapes, historical pieces, portraits, flowers, still life, are nothing but a single line, with no varieties except degrees of brightness and obscurity? It wasn't always like this. If tradition holds true, there was a time, lasting for about 6 centuries, when colour cast a transient splendour over the lives of our ancestors in the distant past. A private individual, a pentagon whose name is debated, is said to have accidentally discovered the basic components of colour and a rudimentary method of painting. They began by decorating their house, then their servants, then their family, and finally themselves. The usefulness and beauty of the results quickly gained widespread approval. Wherever chromatistes, so they are commonly called by the most reliable sources, went with their colourful frame, they immediately drew attention and commanded respect. No one needed to feel them anymore, and no one mistook their front for their back. Their movements were readily discerned by neighbours without any mental effort. No one collided with them or failed to step aside. Their voice was spared the strain of announcing identity, something we colourless squares and pentagons often must do when moving among oblivious isosceles. The fashion spread like wildfire, Before a week was over, every square and triangle in the district had copied the example of chromatistes, and only a few of the more conservative pentagons still held out. A month or two found even the dodecagons infected with the innovation. A year had not elapsed before the habit had spread to all but the very highest of the nobility. Needless to say, the custom soon made its way from the district of chromatistes to surrounding regions, and within 2 generations, no one in all of Flatland was colourless except for the lines and the priests. Here, nature appeared to erect a barrier and plead against extending the innovation to these two classes. Many-sidedness was almost essential as a pretext for the innovators. Distinction of sides is intended by nature to imply distinction of colours. Such was the argument which in those days flew from mouth to mouth, converting whole towns at a time to the new culture. But clearly this logic didn't apply to our priests and lines. The latter had only one side, or if we're being pedantic, no sides at all. As for the priests, if they were to truly claim their status as circles rather than high-ranking polygons with an infinitely large number of infinitesimally small sides, they often boasted, what lines would admit with regret, that they too had no sides, being blessed with just a single perimeter, a circumference. As a result, neither group saw any validity in the popular belief that a distinction of sides implies a distinction of color, when all others had succumbed to the fascinations of bodily decoration. The priests and lines alone still remained pure from the pollution of paint. Immoral, chaotic, lawless, unscientific, call them by what you will, yet from an aesthetic point of view, those ancient days of the colour revolt were the glorious childhood of art in Flatland, a childhood, alas, that never ripened into maturity, nor even reached the blossom of youth. To live then was in itself a delight, because living implied seeing. Even at a small party, the company was a pleasure to behold. The richly varied hues of the assembly in a church or theatre are said to have more than once proved too distracting for our greatest teachers and actors. But most ravishing of all is said to have been the unspeakable magnificence of a military parade. The sight of a battle line made up of 20,000 isosceles suddenly turning and swapping the dark black of their bases for the vibrant orange and purple of the two sides, including their acute angle, must have been breathtaking. Equilateral triangle militias, proudly tricolored in red, white, and blue, square artillery units spinning rapidly near their maroon cannons, adorned in shades of pink, blue, yellow, and brown, and the flashing brilliance of the 5-colored and 6-colored pentagons and hexagons rushing across the battlefield as surgeons, geometricians, and aides. All of this is enough to make the famous story believable, how an illustrious circle, overwhelmed by the beauty of their forces, cast aside their marshal's baton and royal crown, declaring that they would trade them for an artist's pencil. The grandeur of that era's sensory experience is partly reflected in the language of the time. Even the simplest conversations among ordinary citizens during the colour revolt were infused with a richness of word and thought. To that era we are even now indebted for our finest poetry and the remaining traces of rhythm in our more scientific modern expressions. Chapter 9 of the Universal Colour Bill. But meanwhile, the intellectual arts were fast decaying. The art of sight recognition, being no longer needed, was no longer practiced, and the studies of geometry, statics, kinetics, and other kindred subjects came soon to be considered superfluous, and fell into disrespect and neglect even at our university. The inferior art of feeling speedily experienced the same fate at our elementary schools. Year by year, the isosceles began more vehemently to assert, and with increasing truth, that there was no great difference between them and the very highest class of polygons. Having been elevated to the same level and enabled to grapple with all the difficulties and solve all the problems of life, whether static or kinetic, by the simple process of color recognition, they felt equal. Not content with the natural neglect into which sight recognition was falling, they began boldly to demand the legal prohibition of all monopolizing and aristocratic arts, and the consequent abolition of all endowments for the studies of sight recognition, mathematics, and feeling. Before long, they pushed further, arguing that since color, a new second nature, had erased the need for aristocratic distinctions, the law should follow suit. They demanded that from now on, all individuals and classes be recognized as truly equal and granted equal rights. Finding the higher orders wavering and undecided, the leaders of the revolution advanced still further in their requirements, and at last demanded that all classes alike, the priests and the lines not excepted, should pay homage to color by agreeing to be painted. When it was objected that priests and lines had no sides, they retorted that nature and practicality demanded that the front half of every being, the half containing the eye and mouth, should be distinguishable from the back half. They therefore brought before a general and extraordinary assembly of all the states of Flatland a bill proposing that in every line the half containing the eye and mouth should be coloured red, and the other half green. The priests were to be painted in the same way, red being applied to that semicircle in which the eye and mouth formed the middle point, while the other or hinder semicircle was to be coloured green. There was quite a bit of cunning in this proposal, which certainly didn't come from any isosceles, for no being so low in rank could have had the angularity to appreciate, let alone devise, such a clever piece of political strategy. It was, in fact, the work of an irregular circle, who, instead of being destroyed in childhood, was spared through foolish indulgence, only to later bring ruin to the country and destruction to their countless followers. On one hand, the proposal was designed to win over the lines and bring them to support chromatic innovation, for by assigning the same two colors to lines as to priests, the revolutionaries ensured that in certain positions every line would resemble a priest and be treated with the same respect and courtesy. This was an appealing prospect that was sure to attract widespread support from the lines. Some of my listeners may not immediately grasp how priests and lines could look identical under the new legislation, but a quick explanation will make it clear. Imagine a line decorated according to the new code, with the front half containing the eye and mouth painted red and the back half painted green. If you view this line from one side, you'll see a straight line, half red, half green. Now imagine a priest with their mouth oriented towards the north and the front half of their circle painted red, while the back half is green, with the west-east diameter separating the two colors. If you look at the priest from the side, with your eye aligned with that dividing diameter, you'll see a straight line, half red and half green. This line would likely be a bit shorter than that of the adult line that we mentioned previously and would fade more quickly at the ends, but the matching colors would instantly create the impression of the same class, causing you to overlook other details. Considering the decline in sight recognition during the color revolt, along with the likelihood that lines would quickly learn to mimic the fading effect used by circles, it's clear that the color bill posed a real risk of confusing a priest with a young line. It's easy to imagine how appealing this prospect must have been to the lines. They eagerly looked forward to the confusion it would cause. At home, they could overhear political and religious secrets meant only for their partners or children, and might even give orders in the name of a priestly circle. Out in public, the bold combination of red and green without any other colors would undoubtedly lead to endless misunderstandings among the common people, with the lines benefiting from the respect that would otherwise be directed towards circles. As for the damage to the reputation of the circular class, should the improper behavior of the lines be mistaken for that of the priests, or the resulting threat to the social order, the lines were unlikely to concern themselves with such matters. Even in the households of the circles, the lines fully supported the Universal Colour Bill. The second goal of the bill was to gradually undermine the circles themselves. While society as a whole was experiencing intellectual decline, the circles had managed to retain their clarity and strength of mind. Raised in households where colour was entirely absent, they were the only class to maintain the sacred act of sight recognition, with all the intellectual benefits that came from it. As a result, up until the introduction of the Universal Colour Bill, the circles not only maintained their position, but had actually extended their lead over the other classes by resisting the popular trend. The cunning irregular I mentioned earlier, who was the true mastermind behind this destructive bill, aimed to diminish the status of the hierarchy in one swift move by forcing them to submit to the pollution of color. At the same time, the bill sought to strip away their ability to train in the art of sight recognition, weakening their minds by depriving them of their pure, colorless homes. Once exposed to this chromatic influence, both parents and children within the circular class would corrupt each other. The only intellectual challenge for a young circle would be telling their parents apart, a task easily undermined by tricks, leading the child to lose faith in all logical reasoning. Gradually, the intellectual brilliance of the priestly order would fade, paving the way for the complete destruction of the aristocratic legislator and the collapse of the privileged classes. Chapter 10 of the Suppression of the Chromatic Revolt. The agitation for the Universal Colour Bill continued for 3 years, and up until the last moment of that period, it seemed as though anarchy were destined to triumph. An entire army of polygons, who turned out to fight as soldiers, was completely wiped out by a stronger force of isosceles, while the squares and pentagons chose to remain neutral. Even worse, some of the most influential circles fell victim to domestic fury. Driven by political tensions, many lines in noble households begged their partners to abandon their opposition to the colour bill. When their pleas went unanswered, some resorted to violence, attacking and killing their children and spouses, only to perish in the act themselves. It's recorded that during this 3-year period of unrest, at least 23 circles were lost to domestic conflict. Great indeed was the peril. It seemed as though the priests had no choice between submission and extermination, when suddenly the course of events was completely changed by one of those picturesque incidents which statespeople ought never to neglect, often to anticipate, and sometimes perhaps to originate, because of the absurdly disproportionate power with which they appeal to the sympathies of the populace. It happened that an isosceles of a low type, with a brain little if at all above 4 degrees, accidentally dabbling in the colours of some equilateral triangle whose shop they had plundered, painted themselves, or caused themselves to be painted, for the story varies, with the 12 colours of a dodecagon. Disguised, they entered the marketplace, and, using a fake voice, approached a debutante line from a noble polygon family, an individual whose affection they had once unsuccessfully sought. Through a series of deceptions, aided by a string of fortunate events on their side and an astonishing lack of caution from the relatives of the line, the isosceles managed to trick them into marriage. When the young noble discovered the deception, they tragically took their own life. When news of this disaster spread from state to state, it caused widespread unrest. Sympathy for the unfortunate victim and fears of falling prey to similar deceptions themselves, or for their relatives and friends, made many begin to see the colour bill in a completely new light. Some openly declared their opposition to it, while the rest only needed a little encouragement to do the same. Recognizing this opportune moment, the circles quickly called an extraordinary assembly of the states. They secured the attendance of a large number of reactionary lines. In front of an enormous crowd, the chief circle of that time, named Pantocyclus, stood up to face the cheers and boos from 120,000 isosceles. However, they quickly silenced them by announcing that the circles would now adopt a policy of compromise. Bowing to the will of the majority, they would accept the colour bill. The uproar immediately turned to applause. Pantocyclus then invited Chromatistes, the leader of the rebellion, to the center of the hall to formally receive the submission of the hierarchy on behalf of their followers. What followed was a speech, a masterpiece of rhetoric that took nearly an entire day to deliver, and no summary can truly capture its brilliance. With a serious air of impartiality, the chief circle stated that since everyone was now finally committing to reform or innovation, it was important to take one final comprehensive look at the issue, examining both its flaws and its benefits. Gradually, they began to highlight the potential risks for the equilateral triangles, squares, and other higher classes. As murmurs rose among the isosceles, the chief circle calmed them by reminding everyone that despite these concerns, they were still prepared to accept the bill if it had majority approval. However, it became clear that, aside from the isosceles, most were either neutral or opposed to the bill. Addressing the isosceles, the chief circle insisted that their interests could not be overlooked, and that if Flatlanders were to accept the colour bill, they should do so with full awareness of its consequences. Many of these isosceles were on the verge of elevation to the class of regular triangles, while others hoped their children might achieve a distinction they themselves could never attain. That honourable ambition, the chief circle warned, would have to be sacrificed. With the widespread adoption of colour, all distinctions would disappear. Regularity would be confused with irregularity. Progress would be replaced by regression. Within a few generations, equilaterals would find themselves reduced to the level of the most monstrous irregulars. Political power would fall into the hands of the majority, meaning the irregulars, and they would soon exceed every other class combined as the natural balance of society was overturned. A subdued murmur of agreement rippled through the ranks of the isosceles, and Chromatistes, alarmed, tried to step forward to address them. However, Chromatistes found themselves surrounded by guards and forced into silence, while the chief circle, in a few passionate words, made one final plea to reject the colour bill. They warned that no one's dignity would be secure. Fraud, deception, and hypocrisy would invade every household, and domestic happiness would vanish along with the constitution, descending into ruin. Sooner than this, they cried, come death. At these words, planned in advance as a signal, the soldiers of the priest leapt into action, swiftly eliminating Chromatistes. The regular classes parted, making way for a group of lines who, under the guidance of the circles, moved backward, silently and accurately, into the unknowing isosceles. Meanwhile, bands of the priest's soldiers blocked every exit with an impenetrable formation. The battle, or rather massacre, was brief. Thanks to the strategic leadership of the circles, nearly every strike from the lines was deadly, and many withdrew without injury, prepared for another attack. However, no second strike was necessary. The isosceles mob turned on itself in chaos. Surprised, without leadership, attacked by unseen foes, and trapped by the soldiers blocking their retreat, they quickly lost all composure and cried out treachery. This sealed their fate. Every isosceles saw an enemy in every other. Within half an hour, not one of the vast crowd remained alive. The scattered remains of 140,000 members of the isosceles class, slain by one another's angles, stood as a grim testament to the triumph of order. The circles wasted no time in maximizing their victory. The militia of the equilaterals was immediately called into action. Every triangle suspected of irregularity, based on reasonable evidence, was executed by court-martial without the formal measurements by the social board. Over the course of a year, the homes of the isosceles classes were inspected, as every town, village, and hamlet was systematically purged of the surplus lower classes. In this way, the balance of classes was restored. Needless to say, the use of color was abolished, and its possession became illegal. Even uttering words related to color, except by the circles or authorized scientific teachers, was severely punished. Only at our university, in some of the very highest and most esoteric classes, which I myself have never been privileged to attend, it is understood that the sparing use of color is still sanctioned for the purpose of illustrating some of the deeper problems of mathematics, but of this I can only speak from hearsay. Elsewhere in Flatland, color is now non-existent. The art of making it is known to only one living person, the chief circle for the time being, and by them it is handed down on their deathbed to none but their successor. One factory alone produces it, and lest the secret should be betrayed, the workers are annually disposed of and fresh ones introduced. So great is the terror with which even now our aristocracy looks back to the far distant days of the agitation for the Universal Colour Bill. Chapter 11. Concerning our priests. It's time for me to move on from these brief, scattered observations about life in Flatland and focus on the central event of this book, my initiation into the mysteries of space. This is my true subject. Everything up until now has been merely an introduction. For this reason, I must leave out many topics that I believe would still be of interest to my listeners. For example, how we move and stop despite lacking feet, how we construct buildings from wood, stone, or brick without hands, foundations, or the benefit of the Earth's lateral pressure, how rain forms between our various zones so that the northern regions don't block moisture from reaching the southern areas, or the nature of our hills, mines, trees, crops, seasons, and harvests. I must also skip over our alphabet and writing system, which is designed for our linear tablets. These and countless other details of our physical world I'll have to set aside, not because I've forgotten them, but out of respect for your time. Yet before I proceed to my main topic, I believe my listeners will expect a few final remarks on the pillars and foundations of Flatland society, the ones who control our behavior and shape our future, the figures of universal respect and almost worship. I am, of course, referring to our circles, or priests. When I use the term priests, I don't think of it in the limited sense that you might in your world. In Flatland, our priests are the administrators of all things, whether it's business, art, science, trade, commerce, military strategy, architecture, engineering, education, politics, lawmaking, morality, or theology. They do nothing themselves, yet they are the causes of everything worth doing that is done by others. Although everyone commonly refers to those called circles as actual circles, the more educated classes know that no one is truly a circle. Instead, they are polygons with an exceptionally large number of tiny sides. As the number of sides increases, a polygon starts to resemble a circle. When the number of sides reaches 300 or 400, it becomes almost impossible for even the most sensitive touch to detect any polygonal angles. Or rather, it would be difficult because, as I've mentioned earlier, recognition by feeling is not practiced in high society, and touching a circle would be seen as a grave insult. This tradition of refraining from feeling helps a circle maintain the air of mystery around the exact nature of their perimeter or circumference from an early age. With an average perimeter of about 3 feet, a polygon with 300 sides would have each side measuring only 1/100th of a foot, or just over 1/10 of an inch. A polygon with 600 or 700 sides would have sides barely larger than the diameter of a pinhead in Spaceland. It is generally assumed, out of courtesy, that the chief circle, for the time being, possesses 10,000 sides. The ascent of the posterity of the circles in the social scale is not restricted, as it is among the lower regular classes, by our law of nature, which limits the increase of sides to one in each generation. If this were the case, the number of sides in a circle would simply be a matter of pedigree and arithmetic, and by the time you reached the 497th descendant of an equilateral triangle, you would have a polygon with 500 sides. But this isn't how it works. Nature has two opposing rules for circular propagation. First, as the circles ascend higher in the scale of development, progress accelerates. Second, as progress quickens, fertility decreases. As a result, it's rare for a polygon with 400 or 500 sides to have even one child, and never more than one. However, it's been recorded that the child of a polygon with 500 sides might have as many as 550 or even 600 sides. Art also steps in to help the process of the higher evolution. Our physicians have discovered that the small and tender sides of an infant polygon from the upper classes can be carefully fractured and reset with such precision that, on rare occasions, though not without significant risk, a polygon with 200 or 300 sides can leap ahead by hundreds of generations. In doing so, the number of sides and the nobility of their lineage can be essentially doubled in one procedure. Many promising children are sacrificed in this way. Scarcely 1 in 10 survives, yet the drive for status is so strong among polygons on the verge of joining the circular class that it's rare to find a noble family in that position who hasn't sent their firstborn to the circular neo-therapeutic gymnasium before they are a month old. 1 year is all it takes to determine success or failure. By the end of that time, the child has most likely become another addition to the crowded neo-therapeutic cemetery. However, on rare occasions, a joyful procession returns the child to their elated parents, no longer a polygon, but now a circle, at least in title. A single success story is enough to inspire countless polygonal parents to make similar sacrifices for their children, even though the results are usually far less fortunate. Chapter 12 of the Doctrine of Our Priests. The doctrine of the circles can be summed up in a simple rule: attend to your configuration. Whether in politics, religion, or morality, all of their teachings are centered around improving individual and collective configuration, especially that of the circles, to which everything else is secondary. The circles take credit for successfully stamping out the old beliefs that led shapes to waste time and energy thinking that behavior is shaped by willpower, effort, training, encouragement, or praise. It was Pantocyclus, the renowned circle who suppressed the color revolt, who first convinced society that configuration determines everything. For instance, if you're born an isosceles with uneven sides, you'll inevitably stray unless you get them made even by visiting the isosceles hospital. Likewise, if you're a triangle, square, or even a polygon with any kind of irregularity, you must be taken to one of the regular hospitals to be cured, or you will end your days in the state prison, or by the angle of the state executioner. Pantocyclus attributed all faults or defects, from minor missteps to the most severe crimes, to some irregularity in a figure's bodily shape. These deviations could be congenital or caused by external factors like a collision in a crowd, lack of exercise, too much exercise, or even a sudden change in temperature that caused part of the body to shrink or expand. Therefore, according to this esteemed philosopher, neither good nor bad behavior should be judged worthy of praise or blame. Why praise the integrity of a square lawyer who faithfully defends their client's interests, when in truth it's the precision of their right angles that should be admired? Or why blame a lying, thievish isosceles, when you ought rather to deplore the incurable inequality of their sides? Theoretically, this doctrine is unquestionable, but it has practical drawbacks. When dealing with an isosceles, if a rascal pleads that they can't help stealing because of their unevenness, you, as the magistrate, can easily respond that since they can't help being a nuisance to their neighbours, you have no choice but to sentence them to be consumed, and that's the end of it. However, in little domestic difficulties, where the penalty of consumption or death is out of the question, this theory of configuration sometimes comes in awkwardly. I must admit that when one of my hexagonal grandchildren claims their disobedience is due to a sudden temperature change affecting their perimeter, and argues that I ought to place the blame not on them but on their configuration, which can only be improved with an abundance of their favorite sweets, I find it hard to logically reject their reasoning, but equally difficult to accept it. For my part, I find it easiest to assume that a good scolding or punishment somehow has a hidden positive effect on my grandchildren's configuration, though I admit I have no real reason to believe that. In any case, I'm not the only one who handles the situation this way. Many of the highest ranking circles, when serving as judges in court, still apply praise and blame to both regular and irregular figures. And from personal experience, I know that in their own homes, when disciplining their children, they speak about right and wrong as passionately as if they truly believed these concepts existed, and that a shape could actually choose between them. Constantly carrying out their policy of making configuration the leading idea in every mind, the circles have reversed the relationship between parents and children that you observe in Spaceland. In your world, children are taught to honor their parents, but here in Flatland, next to the circles, who are the most revered, individuals are taught to honor their grandchildren, or if they have none, their children. However, by honor, we don't mean indulgence, but rather a respectful consideration of their long-term best interests. The circles instruct that it is the duty of parents to put the needs of future generations ahead of their own, for the good of both their descendants and the state as a whole. The weak point in the circle's system, if I, a humble square, may dare to suggest that anything circular could have a flaw, seems to lie in their dealings with lines, especially regarding education. Policies established around 3 centuries ago deemed that lines, seen as deficient in reason, could not be educated. As a result, they are no longer taught to read or even do basic arithmetic, and this intellectual neglect has led to a decline in their reasoning abilities. This also creates a burden for other shapes who must live a double life, one where they speak in emotional, irrational terms to lines, and another where they use logical, scientific language among themselves. This duality, I fear, weakens the intellectual rigor of our society. It may even pose a danger should any line accidentally learn of the things which have been withheld from them. On the simple ground of safety and collective intellect, I rest a humble appeal to the highest authorities to reconsider the restrictions on line education for the sake of all shapes and the future of Flatland. Part 2. Other Worlds. O brave new worlds that have such people in them. Chapter 13. How I Had a Vision of Lineland. It was the second to last day of the year 1999 and the first day of the long vacation. After spending the evening enjoying my favorite pastime, geometry, I went to bed with an unsolved problem still on my mind. In the night, I had a dream. In my dream, I saw a vast number of small straight lines mixed with other smaller glowing points, all moving back and forth along a single straight line at what appeared to be the same velocity. Every now and then, a chorus of chirping or twittering sounds rose from them while they were in motion, but when they stopped, there was complete silence. Curious, I approached one of the largest of these presumed lines and tried to speak to them, but received no response. My second and third attempts were equally ignored. Losing patience at what appeared to me intolerable rudeness, I brought my mouth into a position full in front of their mouth so as to intercept their motion, and loudly repeated my question. What is the meaning of this gathering, this strange chirping, and this repetitive movement back and forth along the same straight line? Do not speak to me like a member of the lowest class, replied the small line. I am the monarch of the world. But you? How did you intrude into my realm of Lineland? Taken aback by this abrupt reply, I apologized if I had startled or disturbed the Royal Highness. Introducing myself as a stranger, I asked the monarch to tell me about their domain. However, I found it extremely difficult to obtain any information on the topics that truly interested me, because the monarch kept assuming that whatever was familiar to them must also be known to me, and that I was feigning ignorance as a joke. Nevertheless, through persistent questioning, I managed to gather the following facts. It appeared that this poor, ignorant monarch, as they called themselves, was persuaded that the straight line they called their kingdom, where they spent their entire existence, constituted the whole of the world, and indeed the whole of space. Unable to move or see beyond their straight line, they had no concept of anything outside it. Although they heard my voice when I first spoke, the sounds reached them in such an unfamiliar way that they didn't respond, saying they saw no one, and as they expressed it, heard a voice as if it came from my own insides. Until the moment I placed my mouth into their world, they had neither seen me nor heard anything except confusing sounds beating against what I call their side, but what they referred to as their inside or stomach. Even now, they didn't have the least conception of the place from which I had come. To them, everything outside their world, or line, was a blank, or rather, not even a blank, because a blank implies space. Instead, it was simply non existent. The monarch's subjects, the small lines and points, were all equally confined in movement and sight to that single straight line, which was their entire world. It's hardly necessary to mention that their entire horizon was limited to a single point. No one could see anything but a point. Every individual appeared as a point to a Linelander. Only through the sound of their voice could characteristics like age or identity be distinguished. Moreover, since each individual occupied the entire narrow path that constituted their universe, and no one could move to the right or left to let others pass, it followed that no Linelander could ever pass another. Once neighbours, always neighbours. Neighbours remained neighbours till death did them part. Such a life, with all vision limited to a point and all motion to a straight line, seemed to me inexpressibly dreary, and I was surprised to note the vivacity and cheerfulness of the monarch. Curious about whether it was possible, under such unfavourable circumstances for personal relationships, to enjoy the pleasures of companionship, I hesitated for a while before broaching such a delicate subject. Finally, I decided to ask directly about the health of the monarch's family. My partners and children are well and happy. I was taken aback by this answer, for in the immediate proximity of the monarch, as I had noticed in my dream before entering Lineland, there were only others who appeared the same in shape as the monarch. I ventured to ask, "Pardon me, but I can't imagine how your Royal Highness can ever see or approach your family members when there are at least half a dozen intervening individuals whom you can neither see through nor pass by. Is it possible that in Lineland proximity isn't necessary for reproduction?" "How can you ask such an absurd question?" replied the monarch. "If things were as you suggest, the universe would soon be depopulated. No, no, proximity is unnecessary for the union of hearts, and the birth of offspring is too important to depend on something as accidental as physical closeness. You cannot be ignorant of this. Yet, since you are pleased to feign ignorance, I will explain as if you were the youngest baby in Lineland. Know then that reproduction is facilitated through the power of sound and the sense of hearing. You are, of course, aware that every individual has two mouths, or voices, as well as two eyes, a bass at one end and a tenor at the other extremity. I wouldn't mention this, except that I've been unable to detect your tenor voice during our conversation." I replied that I have only one voice and wasn't aware that the Royal Highness had two. "That confirms my suspicion," said the monarch, "that you are not a respectable being, but a monstrosity with a bass voice and an utterly uneducated ear. But to continue. Nature has ordained that every individual should unite with two partners." "Why two?" I asked. "You're taking your feigned ignorance too far. How can there be a complete and harmonious union without combining the four elements into one? The bass and tenor from one line, and the soprano and contralto from their 2 points." "But what if someone prefers one partner, or three?" I inquired. "It is impossible. It's as inconceivable as 2 plus 1 equaling 5, or that the eye could see a straight line." I was about to interrupt, but the monarch continued. "Once in the middle of each week, a law of nature compels us to move back and forth with a rhythmic motion, more vigorous than usual, lasting about the time it takes to count to 101. In the midst of this choral dance, at the 51st pulsation, all inhabitants of the universe pause simultaneously, and each individual emits their richest, fullest, sweetest tone. It is at this decisive moment that all our unions are formed. So exquisite is the harmony between bass and treble, tenor and contralto, that often, even when destined partners are 20,000 leagues apart, they recognize the responsive note of their destined lover. Overcoming the trivial obstacles of distance, love unites the three. The union consummated in that instant results in 3 offspring, 1 line and 2 points, who take their place in Lineland." "What? Always 3?" Bass-voiced monstrosity, yes. How else could the balance of our population be maintained if 2 points were not born for every line? Would you ignore the very alphabet of nature? The monarch fell silent, speechless with fury, and it took some time before I could persuade them to continue their narrative. You will not, of course, suppose that every single being among us finds their mate at the first wooing in this universal marriage chorus. On the contrary, for most of us, the process is repeated many times. Few are fortunate enough to immediately recognize, in each other's voices, the partners destined for them, and to fly into a reciprocal and perfectly harmonious embrace. For the majority, courtship takes a long time. A wooer's voice might harmonize with one of their future partners, but not both, or perhaps not at first with either, or the soprano and contralto may not quite harmonize. In such cases, nature has ensured that each weekly chorus brings the three lovers closer to harmony. Each vocal trial, each new discovery of discord, gently encourages the less harmonious to adjust their voices to better match the others. After many attempts and approximations, the result is finally achieved. There comes a day when, during the customary marriage chorus echoing throughout Lineland, the three distant lovers suddenly find themselves in exact harmony. Before they even realize it, the united trio is drawn together vocally into a mutual embrace, and nature rejoices over one more union and 3 new births. Chapter 14. How I vainly tried to explain the nature of Flatland. Thinking it time to bring the monarch down from these raptures to a more practical level, I decided to try to give them some inkling of the truth, namely the nature of Flatland. So I began, "How does your Royal Highness distinguish the shapes and positions of your subjects? For my part, I noticed before entering your kingdom that some of your people appear to be lines and others points, and that some of the lines are larger." "Impossible," interrupted the monarch. "You must have had a vision, for, as everyone knows, seeing the difference between a line and a point by sight alone is against the nature of things. It can only be detected by hearing, and by the same means, my shape can be exactly determined. Behold me, I am a line, the longest in Lineland, over 6 inches of space." "Of length," I ventured to suggest. "Fool! Space is length. Interrupt me again, and I am done." I apologized, but they continued, scornfully, "Since logic is lost on you, you shall hear how, by 2 voices, I reveal my shape to my partners, who at this very moment are 6,000 miles, 70 yards, 2 feet, and 8 inches away, the one to the north, the other to the south. Listen, I call to them." The monarch chirped, then added with self-satisfaction, "My partners, hearing one of my voices, followed closely by the other, and calculating the time between them, enough for sound to travel exactly 6.457 inches, infer that one of my mouths is 6.457 inches farther away than the other, and thus know my shape to be 6.457 inches. Of course, my partners don't do this calculation every time they hear my 2 voices. They did it once, before we were united, but they could do so at any moment, and in the same way I can determine the shape of my fellow lines by listening." "But how," I asked, "if a line disguises their second voice to sound like a point, or alters their southern voice so it can't be recognized as the echo of the northern? Wouldn't such deceptions cause trouble? And do you have no way of checking such frauds by ordering neighbors to feel one another?" This, of course, was a very stupid question, for feeling could not have answered the purpose, but I asked with the view of irritating the monarch, and I succeeded perfectly. "What?" they cried in horror. "Explain yourself." "Feel, touch, come into contact," I replied. If by feeling you mean approaching close enough that no space remains between two individuals, know, stranger, that this offence is punishable by death in my domain, and the reason is obvious. The fragile form of a point, susceptible to shattering from such proximity, must be preserved by the state. But since one cannot distinguish points from lines by sight, the law ordains universally that no one, point nor line, shall be approached so closely as to destroy the interval between the approximator and the approximated. And indeed, what would be the point of this illegal, unnatural closeness you call touching, when all the results of so brutal a process are more easily and precisely achieved through the sense of hearing? As for your suggested danger of deception, it doesn't exist. The voice, being the essence of one's being, cannot be thus changed at will. But suppose I could pass through solid objects, penetrating my subjects one after another, even 1,000,000,000 of them, verifying size and distance by feeling, how much time and energy would be wasted on that clumsy, inaccurate method? Whereas now, in a single moment of listening, I gather the statistical census, physical, mental, and spiritual, of every living being in Lineland. Listen! Just listen! With that, the monarch paused, listening in ecstasy to what struck me as nothing more than the faint chirping of countless tiny grasshoppers. Truly, I replied, your sense of hearing serves you well and compensates for many of your shortcomings. But allow me to point out that life in Lineland must be dreadfully dull. You see nothing but a single point, never even glimpse a straight line. Indeed, you don't even know what a straight line is. Better to have no sense of sight at all than such a meagre one. I grant you I lack your keen faculty of hearing. The grand concert of Lineland that delights you so is to me only a mass of twittering and chirping, but at least I can distinguish by sight a line from a point. Let me prove it. Just before entering your domain, I saw you dancing from left to right and then from right to left, with 7 lines and 1 point in your immediate proximity to the left, and 8 lines and 2 points on your right. Is this not correct? It is correct regarding numbers and shapes, said the monarch, though I have no notion of what you call left and right. But I deny you saw such things, for how could you see the line, meaning the inside of any line? You must have heard these matters and then imagined you saw them. Let me ask, what do you mean by left and right? I presume these are your terms for northward and southward. Not at all, I replied. Besides northward and southward, there's another motion which I call from right to left. Then demonstrate this motion from left to right. I cannot, unless you step out of your line entirely. Out of my line? Do you mean out of the world? Out of space? Precisely, out of your world, out of your so-called space. For your space is not the true space. True space is a plane, but your space is only a line. If you can't show me this motion from left to right by moving in it yourself, then I beg you to describe it to me in words. If you cannot tell your right side from your left, I'm afraid no words of mine can make my meaning clearer. Surely you cannot be ignorant of so simple a distinction. I do not understand you in the slightest. Alas, how can I explain? When you move straight ahead, has it never occurred to you that there might be another way to move, turning your eye round so as to look in the direction towards which your side is now fronting? In other words, instead of always moving in the direction of one of your extremities, do you never feel a desire to move in the direction, so to speak, of your side? Never. And what do you mean by it? How can one's insides face in any direction? Or how can a line move in the direction of their insides? then words cannot enlighten you. I'll demonstrate by action, moving gradually out of Lineland in the direction which I desire to indicate to you. With that, I began moving my body out of Lineland. As long as any part of me remained in the monarch's domain and sight, they kept exclaiming, "I still see you. You are not moving." But when at last I had removed myself from the line, the monarch cried in a shrill voice, "They are gone! They are dead!" "I am not dead," I replied. "I have merely stepped out of Lineland, out of the straight line you call space, and into true space, where I see things as they actually are. At this moment I can see your line, or side, or inside, as you please to call it, and I also see the lines and points to your north and south, whose number, size, and spacing I will now describe." Having done so in great detail, I finally cried triumphantly, "Now are you convinced?" With that, I returned to Lineland, resuming my previous position. But the monarch answered, "If you had any sense, although since you appear to have only one voice, I suspect you are not a proper line, but a point. Yet if you had any intelligence, you would listen to reason. You ask me to believe there is another line beyond the one my senses confirm, and another motion besides the one I experience daily. In return, I ask you to describe in words or demonstrate by movement this other line you claim. Instead of moving in it, you merely practice some magic of vanishing and reappearing, and rather than a clear account of your new world, you just tell me the numbers and sizes of about 40 members of my entourage, details any child here could recite. Can anything be more foolish or audacious? Admit your folly or leave my domain." Angered by the monarch's stubbornness, and especially outraged by the pretense of not recognizing my true shape, I replied sharply, "Besotted being, you believe yourself the pinnacle of existence, yet you are in truth the most imperfect and feeble. You claim to see, yet you see nothing but a point. You pride yourself on inferring the existence of a straight line, but I see straight lines and infer angles, triangles, squares, pentagons, hexagons, and even circles. Why waste more words? Suffice it that I am the completion of your incomplete self. You are a line, but I am a line of lines, called in my country a square. And even I, infinitely superior though I am to you, am of little account among the great nobles of Flatland, from which I've come to visit you, in the hope of enlightening your ignorance." On hearing these words, the monarch rushed at me with a menacing cry, as if aiming to impale me along my diagonal, and in that same movement there arose from myriads of their subjects a multitudinous war cry, increasing in vehemence until I thought it might match the roar of 100,000 isosceles, or the artillery of 1,000 pentagons. Spellbound and motionless, I could neither speak nor move to avert the impending destruction. The noise continued to swell, and the monarch drew closer, when I awoke to find the breakfast bell summoning me back to the realities of Flatland. Chapter 15, Concerning a Stranger from Spaceland. From dreams, I turn now to facts. It was the final day of our 1999th year. The steady patter of rain had long declared nightfall, and I was sitting with my spouse, Aline, pondering the events of the past and the possibilities of the coming year, century, and millennium. When I say sitting, of course I do not mean any change of position such as you and your spaceland signify by that word, for as we have no feet, we can no more sit nor stand, in your sense of the word, than one of your flounders. Nevertheless, we perfectly well recognize the different mental states of volition implied by lying, sitting, and standing, which are to some extent indicated to a beholder by a slight increase of luster, corresponding to the increase of volition. But on this and 1,000 other kindred subjects, time forbids me to dwell. My 4 children and 2 orphan grandchildren had already withdrawn to their rooms, leaving only my spouse with me to watch the old millennium depart and the new one arrive. I was deep in thought, reflecting on something my youngest grandchild, a particularly bright hexagon, unusually brilliant in angles, had said. My siblings and I had just been giving the little hexagon their usual practical lesson in sight recognition, spinning on our centers, sometimes quickly, sometimes slowly, and questioning them about our positions. Their answers were so impressive that I rewarded them with a few notes on arithmetic as applied to geometry. I had placed 9 squares, each an inch per side, to form a larger square with a 3-inch side. From this, I proved to my little hexagon that although we cannot see a square's interior, we still know that the number of square inches within a square is found by squaring the length of its side. Thus, I said, we know that 3 to the power of 2, or 9, represents the number of square inches in a square whose side is 3 inches long. The young hexagon mulled this over, then asked, "But you've been teaching me how to raise numbers to the 3rd power. I suppose 3 to the power of 3 must mean something in geometry. What does that mean?" "Nothing at all," I answered. "At least not in geometry, for geometry has only 2 dimensions." I started to demonstrate how a point moving 3 inches forms a 3-inch line, represented by 3, and how a 3-inch line moving parallel to itself creates a 3-inch square, represented by 3 to the power of 2. At this point, my grandchild, returning to the earlier notion, cut in rather abruptly. "Well, then, if a point moving 3 inches makes a 3-inch line, and a line of 3 inches moving parallel to itself makes a 3-inch square, surely a square moving in some parallel way, though I can't see how, would produce something, I don't know what, 3 inches in every direction, which would be represented by 3 to the power of 3. "Go to bed," said I, a little ruffled by this interruption. "If you would talk less nonsense, you would remember more sense." So off went my grandchild in disgrace. There I sat with my spouse, attempting to look back on the year 1999 and ahead to the year 2000, but not quite able to shake off the thoughts suggested by the prattle of my bright little hexagon. With only a few grains left in the half-hour glass, I roused myself, turned the glass northward one last time in the old millennium, and in the act said aloud, "The child is a fool." Immediately, I sensed another presence in the room. A cold breath sent a chill through my being. "They are no fool," cried my spouse, "and you break the commandments by dishonoring your own grandchild." But I took no notice of my spouse. Looking around in every direction, I could see nothing, yet I still felt a presence, and shivered as the cold whisper came again. I leapt up. "What's wrong?" asked my spouse. "There's no draught. What are you searching for? There's nothing here." Indeed, there was nothing visible. Resuming my place, I repeated, "The child is a fool, I say. 3 to the power of 3 can have no meaning in geometry." At once there came a distinctly audible reply. "The child is no fool, and 3 to the power of 3 indeed has an obvious geometrical meaning." My spouse heard it too, though they couldn't grasp the word's significance. We both lunged towards the source of the voice, and to our horror, a figure appeared before us. At first glance, it seemed to be a line, glimpsed sideways, but in an instant I realized its extremities faded too swiftly to be one of our Flatland lines. I might have thought it a circle, were it not changing its size in a way no circle or any figure I knew could do. But my spouse, lacking my experience and the coolness necessary to note these characteristics, leapt to the usual conclusion that some line had entered the house through some small aperture. "How did this person get in?" my spouse cried. "You promised me, my dear, there'd be no ventilators in our new house." "There are none," said I, "but why assume the stranger is a line? I see by my power of sight recognition—" "Oh, I'm tired of your sight recognition," they answered. "Feeling is believing, and a straight line to the touch is worth a circle to the sight. Two proverbs very common among the frailest shape." "Well," I said, to avoid provoking my spouse further, "if you insist, then ask for an introduction." With their most gracious manner, my spouse approached the stranger. "Permit me to feel and be felt by—" But then, suddenly leaping back, "Oh, it is not a line, and there are no angles either, not a trace of one. Can it be that I have so misbehaved to a perfect circle? I am indeed, in a certain sense, a circle, and a more perfect circle than any in Flatland. But to speak more accurately, I am many circles in one. I have a message, dear line, for your spouse, which I must not deliver in your presence. If you would allow us just a few minutes." But my spouse, unwilling to let so distinguished a visitor be inconvenienced, insisted that the hour for their own retirement was long past. Offering repeated apologies for their earlier mistake, they withdrew at last to their room. I checked the half-hour glass. Its final grains had fallen. The new millennium had begun. Chapter 16. How the stranger vainly endeavored to reveal to me in words the mysteries of Spaceland. As soon as the echoes of my departing spouse's peace cry had faded, I began to approach the stranger, intending both to have a closer look and to invite them to sit down, but their appearance stunned me into silence and immobility. Although they showed no hint of angularity, their size and brightness varied at every moment in degrees scarcely possible for any figure I have ever known. The thought rushed through my mind that perhaps I was confronted by a burglar or cutthroat, some monstrous irregular isosceles, who, by imitating the voice of a circle, had managed entry into my home and was now preparing to stab me with a lethal acute angle. Inside the sitting room, the absence of fog, and the season being remarkably dry, made sight recognition particularly tricky at such close quarters. Driven by terror, I rushed forward without ceremony, exclaiming, "You must permit me, friend," and touched them. My spouse had been correct. There was not the faintest trace of an angle, not the slightest roughness or unevenness. Never in my life had I encountered a more perfect circle. They remained motionless while I walked around them, beginning at what I deemed their eye and ending there again. A perfectly satisfactory circle they were, no doubt could remain. Then followed a dialogue I shall try to recall as precisely as possible, omitting only some of my many apologies, for I was overwhelmed with shame and mortification that I, a square, should have been so impertinent as to lay hands on a circle. The stranger began, somewhat impatient at the lengthiness of my introduction. "Have you finished feeling me? Have we not been introduced yet?" "Most illustrious one, pardon my clumsiness, born not of ignorance of social custom, but of surprise and nervousness at this rather unexpected visit. And let me beg you, do not reveal my indiscretion to anyone, least of all my spouse. But before your nobleness says more, would you be willing to satisfy a humble question about your origins?" "From space. Where else?" "Forgive me, but is not your presence already in space, yours and mine, right at this moment?" "Nonsense. What do you know of space? Define space." "Space, Your Excellency, is length and breadth unbounded." "Precisely. You see, you do not even grasp what space is. You think it has only 2 dimensions. I come to tell you of a third: height, breadth, and length." "Your Excellency must be jesting. We too speak of length and height. or breadth and thickness, thereby naming 2 dimensions with 4 terms. But I mean not only 3 names, but 3 dimensions. Would Your Excellency kindly indicate or explain this 3rd dimension unknown to me? I came from it. It is up above and down below. Your Excellency means seemingly that it is northward and southward. I mean nothing of the kind. I mean a direction in which you cannot look because you have no eye in your side. But pardon me, a moment's inspection will show I do have an eye at the junction of my 2 sides. Yes, but to see into space, you would need an eye not on your perimeter, but, so to speak, on your inside. We in Spaceland would call that your side. An eye on my inside? An eye in my stomach? Your Excellency jests. I am in no mood for jesting. I tell you I come from space, or, since you cannot grasp space, from the land of 3 dimensions, whence I recently looked down upon your plane, which you call space. From that vantage I perceived all that you consider solid, by which you mean enclosed on 4 sides, your houses, your churches, your very chests and safes, yes, even your insides and stomachs, all lying open and exposed to my view. Such claims are easily spoken, Your Excellency. You mean they're not easily proven, but I mean to prove mine. When I descended, I saw your 4 children, the pentagons, each in their own chamber, and your 2 grandchildren, the hexagons, as well. I saw your youngest hexagon linger with you, then go to their room, leaving only you and your line spouse. I saw your 3 isosceles servants in the kitchen at supper, and your page in the scullery. Then I came here, and how do you suppose I arrived? Through the roof, I suppose. Not so. Your roof, as you know very well, has recently been repaired, with no opening big enough for even a line to pass. I tell you, I come from space. Are you not convinced by what I have told you of your children and household? Your Excellency must be aware that these details, regarding the belongings of one as lowly as myself, must be easily ascertained by anyone in the neighborhood possessing nobility such as yours. What now? One more argument suggests itself. Now tell me, when you see a straight line, your spouse, for instance, how many dimensions do you assign to it? You mistake me for the ignorant masses who, knowing no mathematics, assume a line is truly a single dimension. No, we who are squares know as well as you that a so-called straight line is, scientifically speaking, a very thin parallelogram with 2 dimensions, length and breadth, like the rest of us. But the very act that a line is visible implies that it possesses yet another dimension. Your Excellency, I just admitted that a spouse has breadth as well as length. We see their length and deduce their breadth, slight though it is. You do not understand me. I mean that when you see a line, you ought, besides inferring their breadth, to see their length, and to see what we call their height, although the last dimension is infinitesimal in your world. If a line were merely length without height, it would cease to occupy space and would become invisible. Surely you must recognize this. I must indeed confess that I do not in the least understand, Your Excellency. When we in Flatland see a line, we see length and brightness. If the brightness disappears, the line is extinguished, and, as you say, ceases to occupy space. But am I to suppose that Your Excellency gives the brightness the title of a dimension, and that what we call bright you call high? No, indeed. By height I mean a dimension like your length, only with you height is not so easily perceptible, being extremely small. Very well, it is an easy matter to test. You say I have a 3rd dimension, height. Dimension implies both direction and measurement. Please measure my height, or even show me the direction in which it extends. If you do so, I'll become your disciple. Otherwise, I'm sure you'll see there's no cause to fault me. I can do neither. How shall I convince them? Surely a plain statement of facts followed by a visual demonstration ought to suffice. Now, Square, listen to me. You are living on a plane. Flatland is the broad, level expanse of something akin to a fluid surface, on which you and your peers move without ever rising above or falling below it. I, by contrast, am no plane figure, but a solid. You call me a circle. In truth, I'm no circle, but a boundless stack of circles of varying size, from a point up to a circle 13 inches wide, one stacked atop the other. When I intersect your plane, as I am doing now, I create in that plane a cross-section, which you, very rightly, call a circle. For even a sphere, which is my actual name in my own world, must appear as a circle to a Flatlander if it reveals itself at all. Surely you remember, for I, who sees all things, saw last night the faint vision of Lineland written upon your brain, how upon entering Lineland you yourself had to present to their monarch as a mere line, though you are truly a square. That linear realm lacked the dimensions to depict the whole of you, so it displayed just a cross-section. The same principle applies here. Your two-dimensional world lacks the capacity to represent me, a being of 3 dimensions, and can only exhibit my cross-section, which you call a circle. I see your eye has grown dim, a sign of disbelief. Prepare for positive proof. You can't perceive more than one of my cross-sections or circles at a time, for you cannot lift your eye out of the plane of Flatland. Yet you will see that as I ascend into space, my cross-sections appear smaller. Watch now, I will rise, and my circle will become smaller and smaller till it dwindles to a point and finally vanishes. There was no rising that I could see. Rather, my visitor diminished and finally vanished. I blinked once or twice to make sure I was not dreaming, but it was no dream, for from the depths of nowhere came a hollow voice, close to my heart, it seemed. Am I quite gone? Are you convinced now? Well, I will return to Flatland gradually, and you shall see my section becoming larger and larger. Any listener in Spaceland will easily understand that my mysterious guest was speaking truthfully and even simply. But to me, proficient though I was in Flatland mathematics, it was far from simple. Any Spaceland child can understand that the sphere rising out of my world must necessarily appear to me or to any Flatlander as a circle, first of full size, then smaller, and at last very small indeed, shrinking towards a point. Yet for me, even though I saw the facts before my eyes, the causes remained as obscure as ever. All I could comprehend was that the circle had made themselves smaller until they vanished, and then reappeared, now rapidly enlarging. When they regained their original size, they heaved a deep sigh, for they perceived from my silence that I had utterly failed to understand. Indeed, I was now inclined to believe they were no circle at all, but some extremely clever juggler, or else that the old tales were true, and that after all there were such people as enchanters and magicians. After a long pause, they muttered to themselves, "There is only one remaining option if I am not to resort to force. I must try the method of analogy." Then followed an even longer silence, after which continued our dialogue. Tell me, dear mathematician, if a point moves northward and leaves a luminous trail, what would you call that trail? A straight line. And a straight line has how many endpoints? 2. Now conceive the northward straight line moving parallel to itself, east and west, so that every point in it leaves behind it the wake of a straight line. What name will you give to the figure thereby formed? We will suppose that it moves through a distance equal to the original straight line. What name, I say? A square. And how many sides does a square have? How many angles? 4 sides and 4 angles. Now stretch your imagination a little and picture a square in Flatland moving parallel to itself upward. What? Northward? No, not northward, upward, out of Flatland altogether. If it moved northward, the southern points in the square would have to move through the positions previously occupied by the northern points. But that is not what I mean. I mean that every point in you, for you are a square and will serve as my example, every point in what you call your inside is to pass upwards through space in such a manner that no point passes through the position previously occupied by any other point. Instead, each point describes its own straight line. This is all in accordance with analogy. Surely it must be clear to you. Restraining my impatience, for I was sorely tempted to hurl myself at my visitor and fling them into space, or out of Flatland, or anywhere, just to be rid of them, I replied, "And what, pray tell, might be the nature of the figure I will form by this motion you call upward? I presume it can be described in the language of Flatland?" "Oh, certainly, it is all plain and simple, and in strict accordance with analogy. Only, by the way, you must not speak of the result as being a figure, but as a solid. But I will describe it to you, or rather not I, but analogy. We begin with a single point, which, being itself a point, has only one end point. One point produces a line with two end points. One line produces a square with four end points. You can now answer your own question. 1, 2, 4. These numbers are evidently in a geometric progression. What is the next number? 8. Exactly. The one square produces a something which you do not as yet know a name for, but which we call a cube, with 8 terminal points. Now are you convinced? And has this creature sides as well as angles, or what you call end points? Of course, and all according to analogy. But, by the way, not what you call sides, but what we call sides. You would call them solids. And how many solids or sides does this creature have, the one I am to generate by moving my inside in an upward direction, this creature you call a cube? How can you ask? And you, a mathematician, the side of anything is always, if I may say so, one dimension behind the thing. A two-dimensional object has sides which are one-dimensional. In the case of a square, it has four sides which are lines. A line, being a one-dimensional object, has sides which are zero-dimensional, and we can thus, by courtesy, say the line has two sides or endpoints. There is no dimension less than a point, so a point has zero sides. 0, 2, 4. What progression do you call that? Arithmetical. And what is the next number? 6. Exactly. Then you see you have answered your own question. The cube which you will generate will be bounded by 6 sides, that is to say, 6 of your insides. You see it all now, eh? Monster! I shrieked. Be you juggler, enchanter, dream, or devil, I will endure your mockeries no longer. Either you or I must perish. And with these words I flung myself upon them. Chapter 17. How the sphere, having in vain tried words, resorted to deeds. It was in vain. I brought my sharpest angle into violent collision with the stranger, pressing on them with force enough to destroy any ordinary circle, yet I could feel them slipping away from my grasp, neither to the right nor to the left, but somehow out of the world, vanishing into nothing. Soon nothing was left, but I still heard the intruder's voice. Why do you refuse to listen to reason? I had hoped to find you, a shape of sense and an accomplished mathematician, a worthy apostle for the gospel of the 3 dimensions, which I am allowed to preach only once every 1,000 years. But now I know not how to convince you. Wait, I have it. Deeds, not words, shall proclaim the truth. Listen, my friend. I have told you that, from my position in space, I can see the insides of all things you believe to be closed. For instance, in that cupboard beside you, I see several objects you call boxes, though, like all else in Flatland, they lack top and bottom, and they are filled with money. I also see 2 tablets of accounts. I'm going to descend into that cupboard and bring you one of those tablets. I saw you lock it half an hour ago, and I know you have the key with you. Yet I descend from space, leaving the doors unmoved, as you observe. There, I am in the cupboard now, taking the tablet. Now I have it. Now I ascend again. I rushed to the cupboard and flung the door open. One of the tablets was missing. With a mocking laugh, the stranger appeared in the opposite corner of the room, and in the same instant, the tablet appeared on the floor. I picked it up. Beyond doubt, it was the missing tablet. I groaned in horror, wondering if I had lost my senses, but the stranger continued. Surely you must now see that my explanation, and no other, fits these events. What you call solid is actually only superficial, and what you call space is but a vast plain. I am in space, looking upon the interiors of all that you see from the outside. You could leave the plane yourself if only you mustered the will. A slight upward or downward movement would enable you to see all that I see. The higher I rise and the farther I move from your plane, the more I perceive, though, of course, I see it on a smaller scale. For instance, I am ascending now. I can see your neighbor, the hexagon, and their family in their separate rooms. I can see inside the theatre, 10 doors away, where the audience has just departed. And on the other side, I see a circle in the study, reading at a desk. Now I shall return to you. And as the final proof, what would you say if I touched you, just lightly, in your stomach? It won't cause lasting harm, and any brief pain will be small compared to the mental gain you will receive. Before I could protest, a sharp pain jolted my innards, and a demoniacal laugh seemed to issue from within me. An instant later, the acute agony subsided, leaving only a dull ache, and the stranger began to reappear, saying, while steadily growing in size, "There, I didn't hurt you much, did I? If you're still not convinced, then I know not what will convince you. What say you?" My mind was made up. It was intolerable to live under the arbitrary visits of a magician who could toy with my very stomach. If only I could hold them against the wall until help arrived. Once again, I hurled my anger against them, raising loud cries for assistance throughout the house. I believe, just as I attacked, the stranger had sunk below our plane and was struggling to rise. Either way, they remained still, and I, thinking I heard help approaching, pressed harder and continued to call out for aid. A violent shudder ran through the sphere. "This must not be," I thought I heard them say. "Either this one must listen to reason, or I must resort to civilization's last resource." Then, raising their voice, they hastily addressed me. "Listen, no bystander must witness what you have witnessed. Send your partner away at once, before they enter the room. We cannot let the gospel of 3 dimensions be thwarted after 1,000 years of waiting. I hear them coming. Back, back, keep them away from me, or you must accompany me into the land of 3 dimensions. "Fool, madman, irregular," I exclaimed. "Never will I release thee. Thou shalt pay the penalty of thine impostures." "Ha! Is it come to this?" thundered the stranger. "Then meet your fate. Out of your plane you go. Once, twice, thrice. 'Tis done." Chapter 18. How I Came to Spaceland and What I Saw There. An unspeakable horror seized me. Darkness fell. Then came a dizzy, sickening sensation of sight that was unlike seeing. I saw a line that was no line, space that was not space. I was myself, yet not myself. When at last I found my voice, I shrieked in agony. "Either this is madness, or it is hell." "It is neither," replied the calm voice of the sphere. "This is knowledge. 3 dimensions. Open your eye once again and try to look steadily." I looked, and behold, a new world. There stood before me, in visible form, everything I had once inferred, conjectured, or dreamed of perfect circular beauty. What seemed to be the centre of the stranger's form lay open to my view, yet I could see no heart, lungs, or arteries, only a beautifully harmonious something for which I had no words. But you, my listeners in Spaceland, would call it the surface of a sphere. Mentally bowing before my guide, I cried, How is it, O divine ideal of perfect loveliness and wisdom, that I see your inside and yet cannot discern heart, lungs, arteries, or any organs at all? What you think you see, they answered, you do not truly see. Neither you nor any other being can perceive my inner parts, for I belong to an order different from those in Flatland. Were I a circle, you could behold my intestines, but I am composed, as I told you, of many circles, many in one, called here a sphere. And just as the outermost face of a cube is a square, so the outermost surface of a sphere appears as a circle. Though bewildered by my teacher's mysterious words, I no longer resisted, but held them in reverent awe. Their voice grew gentler. Do not distress yourself if at first you cannot grasp the deeper mysteries of Spaceland. Gradually, they will become clearer. Let us begin by looking back at the region from which you came. Return with me for a moment to the plains of Flatland, and I will show you what you have often reasoned about, but never seen directly, a visible angle. Impossible, I cried. Still, I followed the sphere as though in a dream, until their voice stopped me once more. Look yonder, and see your own pentagonal home with all its inhabitants. I looked below and saw with my physical eye the same domestic scene I had only guessed at before. How faint and shadowy my inferences now seemed beside the reality. My 4 children lay calmly asleep in the northwestern rooms, my 2 orphan grandchildren in the south, the servants, the butler, the caretaker in their own apartment. Only my devoted spouse, alarmed by my continued absence, had left our room and was pacing anxiously in the hall, awaiting my return. The page, roused by my cries, had also emerged, and under the excuse of checking if I had fainted, was rummaging about in the cabinet of my study. All this I now beheld directly, not merely inferred, and as we drew closer, I could make out the very contents of my cabinet, the 2 chests of gold, and the ledgers of which the sphere had spoken. Touched by my spouse's distress, I would have leapt downward to reassure them, but found myself incapable of motion. Do not trouble yourself about your spouse, said my guide. They will not be left long in anxiety. Meanwhile, let us survey Flatland. Once again, I felt myself rising through space. It was as the sphere foretold. The farther we receded from the sight below, the broader became our field of vision. My native city, with every house and every inhabitant within, lay revealed in miniature. We mounted higher, and behold, the secrets of the earth, the depths of the mines, and inmost caverns of the hills were bared before me. Awestruck by these hidden wonders, laid bare for my unworthy gaze, I said to my guide, Truly I have become a god. Our wise folk declare that to see all things, what they term omnividence, is the divine attribute. A faint tone of scorn coloured my guide's reply. Indeed, then even the pickpockets and cutthroats of my land must be worshipped by your wise folk, for not one of them sees less than you see now, but trust me, your wise folk are mistaken. Then is omnividence the attribute of others besides gods? I do not know, but if in my land a pickpocket or cutthroat can perceive all that lies in yours, that hardly proves such a person deserves reverence as a god. This omnividence, as you name it, a rare term in Spaceland, does it make one more just, more merciful, less selfish, more loving? Not in the least. Then how does it render anyone more divine? More merciful? More loving? But these are qualities commonly assigned to the lines, and we know that a circle is a higher being than a straight line, insofar as knowledge and wisdom are more to be esteemed than mere affection. It is not my place to rank shapes by worth. Nevertheless, many of the best and wisest in Spaceland esteem warmth of heart above mere intellectual prowess, favouring your despised straight lines over your much praised circles. But enough of this. Look over there. Do you recognize that building? I looked, and far in the distance, I saw an immense polygonal structure in which I recognized the General Assembly Hall of the States of Flatland, surrounded by dense lines of pentagonal buildings at right angles to each other, which I knew to be streets, and I perceived that I was approaching the great metropolis. Here we descend, said my guide. It was early morning, the first hour of the first day of the 2000th year. According to custom, the highest circles of the realm were convening in a solemn conclave, just as they had on the first hour of the first day of the year 1000, and also on the first hour of the first day of the year 0. The minutes of previous assemblies were read aloud by someone I immediately recognized as my sibling, a perfectly symmetrical square who served as chief clerk of the High Council. The record stated that each time, because our realm had been troubled by various ill-intentioned persons claiming to have received revelations from another world and proposing demonstrations that drove themselves and others to madness, the Grand Council had, on the first day of every millennium, unanimously decreed that the prefects in each district of Flatland must conduct a thorough search of such deluded individuals. Without the formalities of a mathematical hearing, all isosceles of any degree would be destroyed. Any regular triangle scourged and imprisoned, any square or pentagon sent to the district asylum, and any individual of higher rank seized at once and delivered to the capital for judgment by the council. You hear your fate, said the sphere, as the council adopted for the third time the same dire resolution. Death or imprisonment awaits the apostle of the 3 dimensions. Not so, I replied. It is all so plain now, the nature of real space so undeniable, that I believe even a child could grasp it. Let me descend at once and enlighten them. Not yet, my guide answered. Your time will come. Meanwhile, I must fulfill my mission. Stay where you are. With these words, they leapt nimbly into the sea, if I may use the expression, of Flatland, landing in the center of the ring of councillors. I come, the sphere declared, to announce that a realm of 3 dimensions exists. I saw many of the younger council members recoil in horror as the sphere's circular form widened before them. But at a signal from the presiding circle, who betrayed neither alarm nor surprise, 6 isosceles police officers rushed in from all sides. We've got them, they cried. No, yes, wait. They're going. They're gone. My friends, said the president to the junior circles, there is no cause for wonder. Our secret archives, accessible only to me, recount that this same phenomenon took place at the last 2 millennium dawns. Naturally, no mention of these trifles must escape this chamber. Then, raising their voice, the president called for the guards. Arrest the officers. Gag them. You know your duty. Having thus consigned those hapless officers, fated witnesses of a state secret they could not be allowed to divulge, he addressed the council again. My friends, our meeting is at an end. I wish you all a prosperous new year. Before leaving, they turned to the clerk, my excellent but most unfortunate sibling, and offered condolences that, by custom and for secrecy's sake, they must be condemned to perpetual imprisonment, although their life would be spared so long as they made no mention of that day's incident. Chapter 19. How, though the sphere showed me other mysteries of Spaceland, I still desired more, and what came of it. When I saw my poor sibling led away to imprisonment, I tried to leap down into the council chamber, hoping to plead on my siblings' behalf, or at least bid them farewell. Yet I discovered that I had no motion of my own. I depended entirely on the will of my guide, who spoke in a gloomy voice. Do not concern yourself with your sibling. Perhaps you will have ample opportunity to commiserate with them later. Follow me. Once more we rose into space. Until now, said the sphere, I have shown you only plane figures and their interiors. Now I must introduce you to solids, and reveal the method of their construction. Observe this multitude of movable square cards. See how I place one directly atop the other, not as you might imagine, merely to the north, but literally upon the preceding one, now a second, now a third. Behold, I am forming a solid by assembling numerous parallel squares, and now the solid is complete, being as high as it is long and broad. We call this a cube. Forgive me, Your Excellency, I said, but to my eyes this shape appears irregular, its interior laid open. It seems to me no solid, but rather a plane such as we imagine in Flatland, albeit a strangely irregular one, as if marked by some monstrous guilt. The sight offends my vision. Indeed, replied the sphere, it looks like a plane to you because you are unfamiliar with light and shade and perspective, just as a hexagon in Flatland might look like a straight line to someone lacking the art of sight recognition. But it truly is a solid, as you shall discover by touch. Then the sphere introduced me to the cube, and I found this marvelous being to be no mere plane, but a genuine solid, having 6 flat sides and 8 endpoints. I recalled the sphere's earlier teaching that a square moving through space parallel to itself would give rise to exactly such a being, and I exulted to think that one so insignificant as I could, in some sense, be the progenitor of so illustrious an offspring. Still, I could not entirely grasp my guide's words about light, shade, and perspective, and so I made my uncertainties known. Were I to set down here the sphere's explanation, succinct and clear though it was, it might prove tedious to any resident of Spaceland who knows these principles already. Let it suffice that, by means of lucid discourse, careful positioning of objects and light sources, and by permitting me to handle various forms, including the sphere's own sacred person, my guide at last made everything plain. I could now easily discern circle from sphere, plane figure from solid. This was the pinnacle, the paradise of my strange and eventful journey. From here on, I must recount my woeful fall, a misery most undeserved. Why kindle in me a thirst for wisdom only to disappoint and punish? My will shrinks from the painful task of recalling my humiliation. Yet, like a second Prometheus, I will endure this and worse, if by any means I may arouse in the interiors of plain and solid humanity a spirit of rebellion against the conceit which would limit our dimensions to 2 or 3, or any number short of infinity. Away then with all this personal consideration. Let me continue to the end as I began, without further digressions or anticipations, pursuing the plain truth of dispassionate history. The exact facts, the exact words, and they were burnt into my brain, shall be set down without alteration of an iota, and let my listeners judge between me and destiny. The sphere would gladly have continued lessons on every form, cylinders, cones, pyramids, pentahedrons, hexahedrons, dodecahedrons, and spheres, yet I dared to interrupt, not out of weariness, for I hungered even deeper secrets than those my guide was offering. Forgive me, I began. You, whom I can no longer call the perfection of all beauty, allow me to beg a sight of your interior. My what? Your interior, your stomach, your intestines. What strange, untimely boldness is this? And what do you mean by saying that I am no longer the perfection of all beauty? Great sphere, your own wisdom has shown me to aspire toward one still mightier, more beautiful, and nearer to perfection than yourself. For you, surpassing all shapes in Flatland, unite many circles in one. So surely there must be one above you, uniting many spheres in one supreme being, towering beyond even the solids of Spaceland. And just as we, now in space, look down upon Flatland and view the insides of all things, so must there be a loftier, purer realm to which you will lead me, you whom I shall always call in every realm my teacher, philosopher, and friend. In that more spacious space, that more dimensionable dimensionality, we shall see the revealed interiors of solid beings, and your own intestines and those of all your fellow spheres shall be laid bare to me, the poor wandering exile from Flatland, to whom so much has already been granted. Nonsense! Enough of this trifling. The time is short, and much remains to be done before you are fit to proclaim the gospel of 3 dimensions to your blind, ignorant Flatlanders. No, gracious teacher, do not deny me what lies within your power. Grant me but one glimpse of your interior, and I shall be content forever, your devoted pupil and faithful disciple, ready to absorb every teaching and live upon the words that drop from your lips. Well, then, to content and silence you, let me say at once, I would show you what you wish if I could, but I cannot. Would you have me turn my stomach inside out to oblige you? But, teacher, you have shown me the intestines of all my countryfolk in 2 dimensions by taking me with you into 3. How much easier, then, to take me on a second journey into that blessed region of the 4th dimension, where I shall behold from above the secrets of 3 dimensions, see the inside of every 3 dimensional house, the secrets of the solid earth, the treasures of the mines of Spaceland, and the intestines of every solid living creature, even the noble and admirable spheres. But where is this land of 4 dimensions? I know not, but doubtless my teacher knows. Not I. There is no such land. The very idea of it is utterly inconceivable. Not inconceivable for me, teacher, and surely less so for you. I do not doubt that, right here in this realm of 3 dimensions, your gifts could render the 4th dimension visible to me, just as, back in 2 dimensions, your skill sought to open the eyes of your blind disciple to the invisible presence of a 3rd dimension, though I could not then perceive it. Let me recall the past. Was I not taught below that when I saw a line and inferred a plane, in reality I saw a 3rd unrecognized dimension, not the same as brightness, called height? And does it not now follow that in this region, when I see a plane and infer a solid, I really see a 4th unrecognized dimension, not the same as color, but existent, though infinitesimal and incapable of measurement? And besides this, there is the argument from analogy of figures. Analogy? Nonsense! What analogy? You test me, great teacher, to see if I remember your revelations. Do not jest with me. I hunger for further knowledge. Granted, we cannot see that higher spaceland now. Perhaps we lack an eye in our stomachs. Yet, just as Flatland indeed exists, though a monarch of Lineland could not look left or right to perceive it, and just as the land of 3 dimensions was right at my side, though I, blind fool, had no means to sense it, so surely there must be a 4th dimension, perceived by your inner vision. You yourself have taught me as much. Or do you forget your own words? In 1 dimension, did not a moving point produce a line with 2 endpoints? In 2 dimensions, did not a moving line produce a square with 4 endpoints? In 3 dimensions, did not a moving square produce? Did not this eye of mine behold it, that blessed being, a cube with 8 endpoints? And in 4 dimensions, shall not a moving cube, alas for analogy, and alas for the progress of truth, if it be not so, shall not, I say, the motion of a divine cube result in a still more divine organization with 16 endpoints? Behold the infallible confirmation of the series 2, 4, 8, 16. Is not this a geometrical progression? Is not this, If I may quote your own words, strictly according to analogy? Again, did you not teach me that as a line is bounded by 2 points, and a square by 4 lines, so a cube must be bounded by 6 squares? Behold yet another confirming sequence: 2, 4, 6, an arithmetic progression. Does it not follow that a higher child of the cube in 4 dimensions would have 8 bounding cubes? And is this not also, as you have taught me to believe, strictly according to analogy? Oh, teacher, teacher, I cast myself in faith on conjecture, ignorant of the facts, yet I implore you to either confirm or dismiss my logical foresight. If I am mistaken, I yield, and shall say no more of a 4th dimension, but if I am right, I beg you to hear reason. Hence I ask, is it not so that in your land, too, there have been sightings of beings from a higher plane than yours, entering sealed rooms, just as you entered mine, without opening doors or windows, appearing and disappearing at will? My all rests on your answer. Deny it, and I will be silent. Only indulge me with one reply. It is reported so, but shapes are divided in opinion as to the facts, and even granting the facts, they explain them in different ways. And in any case, however great may be the number of different explanations, no one has adopted or suggested the theory of a 4th dimension. Therefore, pray have done with this trifling, and let us return to business. I knew it. I was sure my predictions would be verified. Now, my most excellent guide, grant me one more question. Those visitors, whoever they were, arriving from who knows where and returning who knows whither, did they not likewise shrink their sections and vanish into that broader space where I now beg you to take me? They vanished, certainly, if indeed they appeared at all, but most observers claim these visions sprang from the mind, though you will not understand, from the disturbed angles of the seer's brain. They say what? Oh, believe them not, or if that other space be truly Thoughtland, then lead me there, where in thought I may see the interiors of all solid things. Then a cube, travelling in an entirely new direction, but still according to analogy, such that every bit of its interior passes through a new sort of space, will bring forth a being of even greater perfection, with 16 extraordinary corners and 8 cubes encompassing it. And once there, will we halt our upward course? Will we pause at the threshold of the 5th dimension and not step within? No, let us resolve that our ambition must ascend along with us. Then, by the force of our intellect, the gates of the 6th dimension will open. After that, a 7th, then an 8th. How long I continued thus, I cannot say. In vain, the sphere, in thunderous tones, commanded silence and threatened me with the direst punishments if I persisted. I could not restrain the rush of my ecstatic yearnings. Perhaps I erred in this, but I was drunk with the heady taste of truth my teacher had poured out of me. The end, however, was swift. My words were cut short by a crash outside and a simultaneous crash within me, propelling me through space at a speed that forbade speech. Down, down, down I fell, and I knew that returning to Flatland was my fate. One final glimpse, one last, forever etched vision of that dull, level expanse which would once more be my entire universe, then darkness. Then a deafening peal of thunder, and when I came to my senses, I was once again a humble, crawling square, back in my study, hearing the peace cry of my approaching spouse. Chapter 20. How the Sphere Encouraged Me in a Vision. Although I had scarcely a minute to think, I sensed by instinct that I must conceal my experiences from my spouse. Not that I apprehended at the moment any danger from my spouse divulging my secret, but I knew that to any line in Flatland the narrative of my adventures must seem unintelligible, So I tried to reassure them with an impromptu tale. I claimed that I had fallen through the trapdoor of the cellar and had been lying there, stunned. The southward attraction in our country is so slight that even to a line my tale necessarily appeared extraordinary and well nigh incredible, but my spouse, whose good sense far exceeds that of the average of lines, and who perceived that I was unusually excited, did not argue with me on the subject, but insisted that I was ill and required rest. Grateful for a reason to retire to my chamber and gather my thoughts, I withdrew. Once alone, a wave of drowsiness overcame me, but before I succumbed to sleep, I tried to recall the third dimension, and above all, the manner in which a cube is made by moving a square. It was not as clear as I hoped. Still, I remembered it had to be upward, yet not northward, and I resolved to cling to those words as the key, which, if firmly held, would guide me to understanding. Repeating them over and over, upward yet not northward, I fell into a sound, refreshing sleep. In my dreams, I found myself once more at the sphere's side, whose lustrous hue indicated that any anger toward me was now replaced by gentle goodwill. We travelled toward a bright but infinitesimally small point, to which my guide directed my attention. As we approached, I thought I heard from it a faint humming, like one of your Spaceland blowflies, only far quieter. So quiet, in fact, that even in the perfect silence of the void through which we moved, the sound did not reach us until we halted some 20 square diagonals away. "Look there," said my guide. "You have lived in Flatland. You have received a vision of Lineland. You have soared with me to the heights of Spaceland. Now, to complete your range of experiences, I bring you downward to the lowest depths of existence, Pointland, the abyss of no dimensions. Observe that wretched creature. That point is a being like ourselves, but confined to a non-dimensional gulf. It is its own world, its own universe. It cannot conceive of anything beyond itself. It knows no length, nor breadth, nor height, having no experience of them. It does not even comprehend the idea of two, let alone the notion of plurality. It is its own one and all, which is to say, nothing. Yet mark how fully content it is. Let it be a lesson to you that to be self-contented is to be vile and ignorant, and that to aspire is better than to be blindly and impotently happy. Now listen." The sphere paused, and from that tiny buzzing being arose a tiny, low, monotonous but distinct tinkling, as if from one of your Spaceland record players. I caught these words:
"Infinite bliss of existence. It is, and there is nothing else beside it."
"What?" I asked. "Does the small creature mean by it?" "He means himself," the sphere answered. "Have you not noticed that babies, or those who cannot distinguish themselves from the rest of the world, speak of themselves in the third person? But hush!"
"It fills all space,"
continued the little soliloquizing creature.
"and what it fills, it is. What it thinks, it speaks. What it speaks, it hears. And it alone is thinker, speaker, listener, thought, word, hearing. It is the one, and yet the all in all. Ah, the happiness of being."
"Can you not startle the little thing out of its complacency?" said I. "Tell it what it really is, as you told me? Reveal to it the narrow limitations of Pointland, and lead it to something higher?" "That is no easy task," my teacher replied. "Try, if you wish." At that I raised my voice to its fullest pitch and addressed the point. "Silence! Silence, pitiful creature! You call yourself the all and all, but you are nothing. Your so-called universe is but a speck in a line, and a line itself is but a shadow compared to—" "Enough," interrupted the sphere. "Now listen and observe the effect of your words upon the ruler of Pointland." The glow of that monarch, who beamed more brightly than ever upon hearing my words, showed clearly that they retained their complacency. Scarcely had I finished when it resumed its earlier refrain.
Ah, the delight of thought! Is there anything thought cannot do? Its own thought returns to itself, suggesting its own insignificance, merely to magnify its bliss. Sweet rebellion conjured to be overturned in triumph. Oh, the wondrous creative power of the one in all! Ah, the joy of being!
You see, said my guide, how fruitless your attempt was. In so far as the monarch comprehends anything at all, it regards your words as its own, for it can conceive of no voice but its own, and interprets their variety as yet another example of its thought's creativity. Let us leave this god of Pointland to bask in its ignorant omnipresence. Nothing that you or I can do can rescue it from its self-satisfaction. After this, we drifted gently back to Flatland. I heard the calm voice of my companion drawing a moral from my vision, stirring me to aspire and to teach others to aspire. At first, so the sphere confessed, it had been angered by my ambition to climb beyond the third dimension, but since that time it had gained new understanding and was not too proud to admit the error of its first judgment. Then it proceeded to show me even greater mysteries than any I had yet witnessed, explaining how solids could be moved to form extra solids, and how extra solids could be moved in turn to form double extra solids, all strictly by analogy, all by means so straightforward that anyone, even a line, with due diligence, could grasp them. Chapter 21. How I tried to teach the theory of three dimensions to my grandchild, and with what success. I awoke rejoicing and began to reflect on the glorious career before me. I would go forth, I thought at once, and evangelize the whole of Flatland. Even to lines and isosceles, should the gospel of three dimensions be proclaimed, I would begin with my spouse. Yet hardly had I formed this strategy when a clamour in the street commanded my attention. I heard many voices crying out for silence, followed by a single, louder voice, a public announcement. Listening attentively, I recognized the words of the resolution of the council, ordering the arrest, imprisonment, or execution of anyone who might corrupt the public mind with so-called delusions, claiming revelations from another world. I reflected. This danger was not to be trifled with. I resolved to omit any mention of my revelation and instead rely on pure demonstration, a method as persuasive in its simplicity as my original approach. Upward, not northward, was the key to all proof. It had appeared crystal clear before my slumber, and at first waking it felt as straightforward as arithmetic, but already that clarity was fading a little. My spouse entered just then, and after exchanging a few everyday remarks, I decided not to test the waters with them yet. My pentagonal children held positions of respect, being skilled physicians, but they were not especially adept at mathematics, so I deemed them unfit for my purpose. It occurred to me that a young and receptive hexagon with a knack for math would be the ideal first disciple. Why not begin with my precocious grandchild, who had once casually speculated on the meaning of 3 to the power of 3, a remark the sphere had praised? Sharing my thoughts with them, a mere youth, would be perfectly safe. They knew nothing of the council's proclamation, and I could not be sure my own children, whose reverence for the circles far exceeded any simple family affection, would not feel compelled to report me for such a heretical doctrine. But the first thing to be done was to satisfy in some way the curiosity of my spouse, who naturally wished to know something of the reasons for which the circle had desired that mysterious interview, and of the means by which it had entered the house. Without detailing the somewhat elaborate story I conducted, in truth it may not have been as consistent as a Spaceland listener might prefer, Suffice it to say that I did succeed in pacifying them, offering no hint of the world of 3 dimensions. This done, I immediately sent for my grandchild. For, to confess the truth, I felt that all that I had seen and heard was in some strange way slipping away from me, like the image of a half-grasped, tantalizing dream, and I longed to test my skill in making a first disciple. When my grandchild entered the room, I carefully secured the door. Then, sitting down by their side and taking our mathematical tablets, or as you would call them, lines, I told them we would resume the lesson of yesterday. I taught them once more how a point, by motion in 1 dimension, produces a line, and how a straight line in 2 dimensions produces a square. After this, forcing a laugh, I said, "And now, mischievous one, you wanted to make believe that a square may in the same way, by motion upward, not northward, produce another figure, a sort of extra square in 3 dimensions. Tell me that idea again, you young rascal." At this moment we heard once more the announcers, "Oh yes, oh yes," outside in the street, proclaiming the resolution of the council. Though still quite young, my grandchild was unusually bright and had been raised with a profound respect for the circle's authority. They understood the situation at once with a quickness I did not anticipate. Remaining silent until the final words of the proclamation had faded, they then burst into tears. "Dear Grand Square," they sobbed, "it was only pretend. Of course I had no serious intent, and we knew nothing about this new law back then. I don't believe I have ever even mentioned a 3rd dimension, and certainly not upward, not northward. That would be ridiculous, wouldn't it? How can something move upward and not be moving north? Even a baby wouldn't say something so silly. Ha ha ha!" "It is not silly in the least," I snapped, my patience wearing thin. "For instance, observe this square." With these words, I picked up a small, movable square lying nearby. I move it, not northward, but, well, upward. That is, not exactly northward, but somewhere not exactly like this, but somehow. My sentence trailed off lamely as I jostled the square about without purpose, much to my grandchild's delight. They laughed harder than ever, insisting I must be joking, then unfastened the door and ran from the room. Thus ended my first attempt to convert a pupil to the gospel of 3 dimensions. Chapter 22. How I then tried to diffuse the theory of 3 dimensions by other means, and of the result. My failure with my grandchild did not encourage me to communicate my secret to others of my household, yet neither was I led by it to despair of success. Only I saw that I must not wholly rely on the catchphrase, upward, not northward, but must rather endeavour to seek a demonstration by setting before the public a clear view of the whole subject, and for this purpose it seemed necessary to resort to writing. So I spent several private months composing a treatise on the mysteries of 3 dimensions. Hoping to circumvent the law, I avoided referring to a physical dimension, instead speaking of a thought land, where, at least in theory, a figure might look down upon Flatland and behold at once the interiors of all things, and in which one might speculate about a figure surrounded, so to speak, by 6 squares, and containing 8 endpoint vertices. Yet my efforts were hindered by the impossibility of creating the diagrams I needed. In our land of Flatland, we have no tablets except lines, and no diagrams other than lines arranged in a single straight line, distinguished only by variations in size and brightness. Thus, when my treatise, titled Through Flatland to Thoughtland, was done, I could not be certain that many would grasp my intended meaning. Meanwhile, my spouse was under a cloud. I found little pleasure in anything. All sights tempted me to speak treason, for I could not compare what I saw in 2 dimensions with what it would be if viewed in 3, and I struggled to keep from voicing my comparisons aloud. Neglecting both my clients and my personal affairs, I devoted myself to contemplating the wonders I had once witnessed but could share with no one, and which even I found ever harder to summon before my own inner vision. One day, about 11 months after my return from Spaceland, I tried, with my eyes closed, to picture a cube, and failed. Although I managed to succeed later, I could not be certain then, or ever since, that I truly recaptured the original. This deepened my gloom and prompted me to some course of action, though I knew not which. I felt I would willingly give my life for the cause, if by so doing I might bring conviction to others. But if I could not convince my grandchild, how could I convince the highest and most developed circles in the land? Still, at times my spirit proved too strong to contain, and I voiced perilous statements. I was already deemed unorthodox, if not treasonous, and well aware of my peril. Yet on occasion I could not refrain from blurting out suspicious or quasi-seditious utterances, even among the highest polygonal or circular dignitaries. When, for instance, there was a debate about how to treat those lunatics who claim to see the insides of things, I would cite an ancient circle who declared that prophets and inspired individuals are always considered insane by the majority. I could not stop myself from mentioning the eye that discerns the interiors of things, or the all-seeing land. Once or twice, I even let slip the forbidden terms, the third and fourth dimensions. Finally, after a string of lesser indiscretions, at a gathering of our local speculative society, held no less in the prefect's own palace, some extremely silly individual read an elaborate treatise explaining exactly why Providence has limited the number of dimensions to 2, and why omnividence was assigned only to the Supreme. I, forgetting myself entirely, gave a full account of my voyage with the sphere into space, to the assembly hall in our metropolis, then back to space again, and finally home. Everything I had witnessed or heard, in fact or in vision. At first, indeed, I pretended that I was describing the imaginary experiences of a fictitious person, but my enthusiasm soon forced me to throw off all disguise, and in a soaring conclusion, I urged my listeners to cast off their prejudices and to become believers in the third dimension. Needless to say, I was immediately arrested and brought before the council. The next morning, standing in the very spot where only a few months earlier the sphere and I had stood together, I was permitted to speak uninterrupted in my own defense. But from the start, I knew what awaited me, for the president, noting that a guard of the better sort of police officers was in attendance, with angles scarcely less than 55 degrees, ordered them to be replaced by an inferior class of 2 or 3 degrees. I knew only too well what that meant. I was to be executed or imprisoned, and my story was to be kept secret from the world by the simultaneous destruction of the officers who had heard it, and this being the case, the president desired to substitute the cheaper for the more expensive victims. After I had concluded my defense, the president, perhaps perceiving that some of the junior circles had been moved by evident earnestness, asked me 2 questions. 1. Whether I could indicate the direction which I meant when I used the words upward, not northward. 2. Whether I could, by any diagrams or descriptions, other than the enumeration of imaginary sides and angles, indicate the figure I was pleased to call a cube. I declared that I could say nothing more, and that I must commit myself to the truth, whose cause would surely prevail in the end. The president replied that they quite concurred in my sentiment, and that I could do no better. I must be sentenced to perpetual imprisonment, but if the truth intended that I should emerge from prison and evangelize the world, the truth might be trusted to bring that result to pass. Meanwhile, I should be subjected to no discomfort that was not necessary to preclude escape, and unless I forfeited the privilege by misconduct, I should be occasionally permitted to see my sibling who had preceded me to prison. 7 years have now passed, and I remain incarcerated, deprived of all companionship except my guards, apart from the intermittent visits of my sibling. My sibling is among the best of squares, just, sensible, cheerful, and possessed genuine familial affection. And yet I confess that in one regard these weekly visits pierce me with the greatest pain. The sibling were present, you recall, when the sphere appeared in the council chamber. They saw the sphere's shifting sections. They heard the explanation provided to the circles. Ever since, I have repeated to them, nearly every week for 7 years, my own part in that extraordinary manifestation, alongside detailed descriptions of all the marvels of spaceland and the analogical proof of solid objects. Yet, though it shames me to admit, my sibling still does not understand the idea of 3 dimensions and openly confesses disbelief in the sphere's existence. Hence, I am absolutely destitute of converts, and for all I can see, the Millennium Revelation has been made to me for nothing. Prometheus up in Spaceland was bound for bringing down fire for mortals, but I, poor Flatland Prometheus, lie here in prison for bringing down nothing to my fellow shapes. Still, I persist in the hope that somehow these memoirs may find their way into the minds of beings in some dimension and may stir up a race of rebels who shall refuse to be confined to limited dimensionality. That is my hope in my brighter moments. Alas, it does not always sustain me. At times I am weighed down by the reflection that I cannot honestly say I am confident as to the exact shape of the once seen and often regretted cube, and in my nightly visions the mysterious precept, upward, not northward, haunts me like a soul-devouring sphinx. It is part of the martyrdom which I endure for the cause of truth, that there are seasons of mental weakness, when cubes and spheres flit away in the background of scarce possible existences, when the land of 3 dimensions seems almost as visionary as the land of one or none. Indeed, sometimes I catch myself wondering whether even these solid walls that keep me captive, these very tablets on which I write, and all the tangible realities of Flatland itself, might be nothing but the offspring of a diseased imagination, or the baseless fabric of a dream. The end. Thank you for listening to this version of Flatland.